The Grizzly Incident at Camp Ridgway. The morning of March 17, 2025, dawned crisp and clear over the Rocky Mountain wilderness of Colorado, the kind of pristine mountain day that made counselors at Camp Ridgway grateful for their chosen profession. At 6,847 feet above sea level, nestled in a valley between towering peaks of the San Isabel National Forest, the camp sprawled across 43 acres of pine-studded terrain, bordered by Willow Creek to the east and the jagged granite walls of Devil's Backbone Ridge to the west. The air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and the lingering chill of winter, though patches of snow had retreated to the shadowed north faces of the surrounding mountains. Mason Fuller, 26 years old and in his third season as head counselor for the Wolverine Cabin, stood on the wooden deck of the main lodge, steam rising from his coffee mug as he surveyed the camp's layout. Mason cut an imposing figure at 6 feet 2 inches, his broad shoulders and muscled frame built from years of outdoor work and competitive rock climbing. His sandy brown hair caught the early sunlight, and his green eyes held the keen alertness of someone who had spent countless hours in the wilderness. Born and raised in Fort Collins, Colorado, Mason had earned his bachelor's degree in outdoor recreation from Colorado State University, where he had been captain of the climbing team and president of the Outdoor Adventure Club. The camp's main lodge, constructed from massive Douglas fir logs in 1987, dominated the central area with its soaring cathedral ceiling and stone fireplace. Radiating outward like spokes of a wheel were 8 wooden cabins, each housing 12 campers and 2 counselors. The Wolverine Cabin, Mason's domain, sat on the northwestern edge of the camp, closest to the tree line where the managed grounds gave way to true wilderness. Between the cabins and the forest, a series of activity areas had been carved from the landscape. The soccer field, where yesterday's game had ended in a disputed penalty kick, the volleyball court with its weathered net, the archery range with its hay bale targets, and the climbing wall that Mason himself had helped construct during his first season. Camp Ridgway had operated for 38 years without a serious incident involving wildlife, a record that Director Patricia Hawthorne mentioned frequently during staff meetings. Patricia, 54 years old, with prematurely grey hair and laugh lines etched from decades of working with children, had run the camp for 15 years. Her philosophy centered on calculated risk-taking, pushing young people beyond their comfort zones while maintaining what she considered appropriate safety margins. The camp's safety protocols, last updated in 2021, included detailed procedures for severe weather, water emergencies, and medical incidents. But the wildlife section consisted of only 2 paragraphs focusing primarily on rattlesnakes and the occasional black bear that might wander through camp in search of improperly stored food. The camp's location in prime grizzly habitat had been noted during the original environmental impact assessments in the 1980s, but no grizzly bears had been officially documented in this particular drainage since 1994. Colorado Parks and Wildlife maintained that the state's grizzly population had been eliminated in the 1950s, though unconfirmed sightings continued to trickle in from hunters and hikers each year. The nearest confirmed grizzly territory lay 300 miles north in Yellowstone National Park, a distance that wildlife biologists considered prohibitive for dispersing bears. Mason's assistant counselor for the Wolverine Cabin was Sarah Chen, 24 years old and completing her master's degree in environmental education at the University of Colorado Boulder. Sarah stood 5 feet 4 inches with straight black hair, typically pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local flora and fauna that impressed even veteran outdoors professionals. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 2 years old, settling in Denver where her father worked as an engineer and her mother taught at a community college. Sarah had discovered her passion for environmental education during undergraduate studies at Colorado College, where she had written her senior thesis on human-wildlife conflict management in recreational areas. The other counsellors at Camp Ridgeway represented a diverse mix of backgrounds and experience levels. Jake Morrison, 25, served as the camp's activities director and led the Eagle Cabin. A former Army Ranger who had completed 2 deployments in Afghanistan, Jake brought military precision to outdoor instruction while maintaining an easy rapport with campers. His experience included advanced wilderness first aid certification and expertise in survival skills that often proved valuable during the camp's overnight expeditions. Rebecca Martinez, 23, counseled the Bear Cabin with assistance from Tommy Nakamura, a 22-year-old recent graduate of the University of Denver's outdoor recreation program. Rebecca, fluent in both English and Spanish, had grown up in a family that ran a guest ranch near Durango, Colorado, giving her extensive experience with horses and large animals. Tommy, whose Japanese-American grandparents had been interned during World War II, brought a quiet intensity to his work and had earned certifications in wilderness search and rescue. The camp's medical officer, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, 41 years old, maintained the small infirmary located adjacent to the main lodge. Dr. Warren had practiced emergency medicine in Denver for 12 years before accepting the camp position, drawn by the opportunity to work with young people while still utilizing her medical skills. Her medical kit included advanced trauma supplies and a satellite communication system capable of summoning helicopter evacuation services, though the nearest hospital lay 63 miles away in Colorado Springs. Camp maintenance fell to Robert Bear Johnson, a 57-year-old former park ranger who had worked at Ridgeway for 8 years. Bear Johnson, whose nickname derived from his imposing 6'4" frame and grizzled beard rather than any wildlife encounter, maintained the camp's facilities, vehicles, and equipment with meticulous care. His background included 20 years with the National Park Service, primarily at Rocky Mountain National Park, where he had developed expertise in wildlife management and backcountry safety protocols. The camp's cooking staff consisted of head chef Maria Santos and her assistant, David Kim. Maria, 38 years old, had trained at the Culinary Institute of America before specializing in camp and outdoor cooking. Her commitment to proper food storage and waste management reflected years of experience in bear country, though she worked within the assumption that only black bears pose potential problems in this region. On this particular March morning, the camp hosted 63 children, ages 8 to 16, divided into age-appropriate groups across the 8 cabins. The Wolverine Cabin housed 12 boys, ages 14 to 16, considered the camp's most experienced and capable campers. These included Alex Brennan, a 15-year-old from Aspen, whose father owned a helicopter skiing company, Marcus Thompson, a 16-year-old from Denver who had attended Ridgeway for 4 consecutive summers, and Timothy Walsh, a 14-year-old from Boulder whose mother served as a federal judge. The previous evening's activities had concluded with a camp-wide soccer tournament, with the final match between the Wolverine Cabin and their rivals from the Eagle Cabin ending in controversy. A disputed penalty kick in the game's final minutes had resulted in heated arguments between players and counselors, ultimately resolved when Director Hawthorne declared the game a tie. The soccer ball, a well-worn FIFA regulation ball bearing the camp's logo, had been kicked over the goal during the disputed play, bouncing twice before rolling approximately 40 yards into the forest beyond the field's western boundary. Marcus Thompson, team captain for the Wolverine Cabin, had volunteered to retrieve the ball after the game's conclusion, but Mason Fuller had declined, citing camp policy prohibiting unsupervised ventures into the forest after dark. The ball remained in the woods overnight, its white and black panels barely visible in the morning light among the fallen pine needles and scattered granite boulders. The morning routine at Camp Ridgeway began at 6:30 with the clanging of the brass bell that hung outside the main lodge, a tradition dating to the camp's founding. Campers had 30 minutes to dress, make their bunks according to military-style standards, and report to the lodge for breakfast. Mason Fuller's reputation as a demanding but fair counselor meant that the Wolverine cabin consistently earned top marks during morning inspections, a source of pride that fostered intense rivalry with other cabins. Breakfast on March 17th featured Maria Santos's famous blueberry pancakes, thick slabs of bacon, and fresh orange juice. The meal proceeded without incident, though several Wolverine cabin members continued to grumble about the previous evening's disputed penalty kick. Marcus Thompson, in particular, expressed frustration that their victory had been denied by what he characterized as biased officiating, and he repeatedly mentioned the soccer ball lying abandoned in the forest. Following breakfast, campers attended a mandatory 30-minute activity period before breaking into smaller groups for specialized instruction. The Wolverine cabin had been assigned to work with Jake Morrison on advanced orienteering techniques, utilizing topographic maps and compass navigation to plot courses through the surrounding wilderness. The lesson took place in the meadow east of the main lodge, well within the camp's developed boundaries, but Jake emphasized the skills application for future overnight expeditions planned later in the week. During the orienteering lesson, Mason Fuller noticed unusual signs in the forest beyond the soccer field. Several mature ponderosa pines showed fresh claw marks approximately 8 feet above ground level, and the bark had been stripped in long vertical gouges characteristic of large bear activity. Additionally, he observed several large tracks in the soft earth near Willow Creek, though the partial impressions prevented definitive species identification. The tracks measured approximately 11 inches in length, with claw marks extending 2 inches beyond the pad impressions, significantly larger than typical black bear sign. Sarah Chen, when consulted about the tracks, expressed uncertainty about their origin. Her field guides indicated that such large tracks could indicate either an exceptionally large black bear or potentially a grizzly bear, though she acknowledged that grizzly presence in Colorado remained highly unlikely. The claw marks on the ponderosa pines troubled her more than the tracks, as black bears typically left shallower scoring when marking territory, while these gouges penetrated nearly an inch into the bark. At 10:15, Mason Fuller approached Director Patricia Hawthorne about the wildlife sign, finding her in the main lodge office reviewing supply inventories. The office, paneled in knotty pine and decorated with decades of camp photographs, reflected Patricia's methodical approach to management. Every surface held carefully organized stacks of paperwork, emergency contact lists, and activity schedules color-coded by cabin groups. "Patricia, I'm concerned about some sign I found near the soccer field this morning," Mason began, settling into the wooden chair across from her desk. "Large tracks near the creek and fresh claw marks on several trees. The scoring is deeper than I'd expect from black bears." Patricia Hawthorne looked up from her inventory sheets, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "How fresh do you think the marks are?" she asked, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to evaluating potential problems. "Within the last day or two, based on the sap flow and the color of the exposed wood," Mason replied. Sarah Chen looked at them as well, and she's concerned about the size and depth. The tracks measure 11 inches, possibly larger, with prominent claw marks. Patricia removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture Mason recognized as her way of buying time while considering options. 11 inches is large for a black bear, but not unprecedented. We've had big boars pass through before, usually in spring when they're ranging widely for mates. The claw marks could indicate territorial behavior, especially if there are females in the area. "That's what concerns me," Mason continued. "If we have an adult male establishing territory nearby, we should adjust our protocols. Keep groups closer to the main camp, maybe postpone the overnight expeditions planned for later this week. Patricia's expression shifted toward what Mason privately termed her administrator mode, the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated she was weighing multiple factors beyond immediate safety concerns. Camp Ridgeway operated on thin profit margins, and cancelling signature programs like overnight expeditions would disappoint families who had paid premium fees specifically for comprehensive wilderness experiences. "Let's not overreact," Patricia said finally. "We've operated here for 38 years without serious wildlife incidents. I'll contact Colorado Parks and Wildlife for guidance, but in the meantime, let's implement enhanced food security measures and require counselors to carry bear spray during all outdoor activities. We'll also institute a buddy system for any ventures beyond the immediate camp perimeter." Mason felt only partially satisfied with these measures, but recognized Patricia's position. Her responsibility extended beyond immediate safety to include the camp's long-term viability and reputation. Overreacting to wildlife sign could establish dangerous precedents that might compromise future operations, while underreacting risked catastrophic consequences if the situation escalated. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who knocked briskly on the office door before entering. Dr. Warren carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and her medical bag always within reach. "I wanted to discuss the wildlife sign that Mason reported," Dr. Warren said, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. "I walked out to examine the tracks and claw marks myself, and I'm concerned we may be dealing with something more significant than a typical black bear." Patricia leaned forward slightly, recognizing the gravity in Dr. Warren's voice. "What makes you say that, Nand?" "The gait pattern in the tracks suggests an animal weighing significantly more than a typical black bear," Dr. Warren explained. "I've seen similar tracks during my medical mission work in Alaska, where grizzly encounters were more common. Additionally, the claw marks show a level of aggression or territorial marking that seems excessive for food-motivated behavior." Mason nodded, feeling vindicated in his concerns. Sarah Chen mentioned similar observations. She's been researching grizzly sign in her graduate studies, and these marks match characteristics she's documented from Yellowstone populations. Patricia Hawthorne felt the weight of decision-making pressing upon her shoulders. 3 decades of camp management had taught her to trust her staff's expertise while balancing multiple competing interests. Parents expected their children to experience meaningful wilderness challenges. Insurance companies required adherence to established safety protocols, and state regulations mandated specific procedures for wildlife encounters. Overreacting to unconfirmed threats could damage the camp's reputation for providing authentic outdoor experiences, while underreacting could result in tragedy. "I'll contact Colorado Parks and Wildlife immediately," Patricia decided. "In the meantime, we'll implement a modified version of our severe weather protocols. All activities remain within visual distance of the main lodge, counselors carry radio communication at all times, and no one ventures beyond the established perimeter without express authorization." Dr. Warren nodded approvingly. "I'd also recommend reviewing our emergency evacuation procedures. The nearest trauma hospital is over an hour away by ground transport, and our helicopter landing zone hasn't been maintained since last season. If we encounter a serious wildlife incident, rapid evacuation could mean the difference between survival and fatality." The helicopter landing zone, located in the meadow southeast of the main lodge, had been established in 1998 following a serious climbing accident that required emergency evacuation. The circular clearing measured 60 feet in diameter, marked by reflective stakes and equipped with a windsock for pilots to assess wind conditions. However, spring snowmelt had left the ground soft and potentially unsuitable for heavy aircraft, while fallen branches from winter storms had partially obscured the perimeter markings. At 11:30, Patricia Hawthorne placed a call to Colorado Parks and Wildlife District Office in Colorado Springs. She spoke with Wildlife Manager James Patterson, a 20-year veteran of the agency who specialized in human-wildlife conflict resolution. Patterson listened carefully to her description of the tracks and claw marks, asking detailed questions about size, location, and behavioral indicators. Based on your description, you're probably dealing with a large black bear, possibly a mature boar, ranging for mates, Patterson advised. This time of year, males can travel significant distances and may become more aggressive if they encounter competition or perceived threats. The claw-marking behavior suggests territorial establishment, which is concerning in a developed area. Patterson agreed to dispatch Wildlife Officer Rebecca Stanton to examine the sign and provide recommendations. Officer Stanton, based in Salida, could reach Camp Ridgway within 3 hours, depending on weather conditions and road accessibility. In the meantime, Patterson recommended heightened vigilance, proper food storage protocols, and immediate evacuation of the area if any bear was observed. Following the phone call, Patricia convened an emergency meeting of senior staff in the main lodge. Mason Fuller, Sarah Chen, Jake Morrison, Dr. Warren, and Bear Johnson gathered around the massive oak table that dominated the lodge's central room. The atmosphere carried unusual tension, as most staff meetings focused on routine operational matters rather than potential safety threats. Wildlife Management has confirmed that we're likely dealing with a large black bear in the immediate area, Patricia began. Officer Stanton will arrive this afternoon to assess the situation and provide recommendations. Until then, we're implementing enhanced safety protocols. Bear Johnson, whose experience with wildlife management surpassed that of other staff members, raised concerns about the timing and location of the tracks. Early spring is mating season for black bears, which makes them unpredictable. A mature boar establishing territory this close to camp represents a significant risk, especially if there are females in the area. Jake Morrison, drawing on his military background, suggested implementing perimeter patrols and establishing clear command structures for potential emergency responses. We should identify rally points for each cabin group and ensure all counselors understand evacuation procedures. In combat situations, preparation prevents panic, and the same principle applies here. Sarah Chen contributed her academic knowledge about bear behavior and biology. Territorial marking typically indicates long-term residence rather than transient passage. If this bear intends to remain in the area, we need to consider fundamental changes to our operations, not just temporary precautions. Dr. Warren emphasized medical preparedness, particularly the challenges of treating severe trauma in a remote location. Bear attacks typically result in massive tissue damage, arterial injuries, and potential infection from bacteria in the animal's claws and teeth. Our medical supplies are adequate for routine injuries, but serious wildlife encounters would require immediate helicopter evacuation. The discussion continued for 45 minutes, covering topics from communication protocols to parent notification procedures. The consensus emerged that while immediate panic was unwarranted, the situation required vigilant monitoring and adherence to enhanced safety measures until Wildlife Officer Stanton could provide professional assessment. Meanwhile, the soccer ball from the previous evening's disputed game remained in the forest beyond the western boundary of the camp, its white and black panels increasingly visible as the morning sun filtered through the pine canopy. Several Wolverine cabin members had mentioned the ball during breakfast, expressing frustration that their equipment remained abandoned in the woods. Marcus Thompson, in particular, had volunteered multiple times to retrieve it, though Mason Fuller continued to decline such requests pending resolution of the wildlife situation. At 12:15, camp activities continued under the modified protocols established during the morning staff meeting. The Wolverine cabin participated in a climbing session on the camp's artificial wall, supervised by Mason Fuller and Sarah Chen, with Jake Morrison providing backup support. The climbing wall, constructed from pressure-treated lumber and equipped with modern safety equipment, offered challenges appropriate for various skill levels while remaining within the secure perimeter established by the enhanced protocols. Marcus Thompson excelled at the climbing activities, his natural athleticism and competitive drive pushing him to attempt routes that challenged even experienced climbers. His success on the wall earned admiration from younger campers, reinforcing his role as an informal leader within the Wolverine cabin. However, his continued mentions of the abandoned soccer ball suggested lingering frustration about the previous evening's disputed game. Timothy Walsh, despite being younger than most Wolverine cabin members, demonstrated remarkable technical proficiency on the climbing wall. His small frame and excellent strength-to-weight ratio allowed him to complete routes that defeated larger, stronger campers. Sarah Chen noted his natural ability and suggested he might benefit from more advanced instruction if his interest continued beyond the camp session. Alex Brennan, whose father's helicopter skiing operation had provided extensive mountain exposure, approached the climbing challenges with casual confidence. His familiarity with technical equipment and exposure to high-consequence environments made him a natural mentor for less experienced campers, though his privileged background sometimes created social tensions within the cabin group. The climbing session proceeded without incident, with all 12 Wolverine cabin members successfully completing routes appropriate to their ability levels. Mason Fuller used the activity to reinforce safety protocols, emphasizing the importance of proper equipment inspection, buddy systems, and clear communication between climbers and belayers. These lessons, while focused on climbing safety, paralleled the enhanced protocols implemented in response to the wildlife situation. Following lunch, served promptly at 1 o'clock, the Wolverine cabin participated in environmental education activities led by Sarah Chen. The session focused on wildlife identification and habitat recognition, with particular emphasis on distinguishing between black bear and grizzly bear sign. Sarah used the morning's discoveries as educational opportunities, though she carefully avoided creating unnecessary anxiety among the campers. Bears mark territory for several reasons, Sarah explained, pointing to photographs of claw marks and tracks in her field guide. Territorial establishment, mate attraction, and resource protection all motivate marking behavior. The size and depth of claw marks can indicate the animal's size and the intensity of its territorial claims. Marcus Thompson raised his hand with a question that had been troubling him since breakfast. If there's a bear in the area, when will it be safe to retrieve our soccer ball from the forest? Sarah exchanged glances with Mason Fuller before responding carefully. Wildlife experts need to assess the situation before we can safely venture beyond our established boundaries. The ball will remain where it is until we receive professional guidance about the bear's behavior and intentions. But it's just 40 yards past the goal line, Marcus persisted. I could run out, grab it, and be back in 30 seconds. The bear probably isn't even there during the day. Mason Fuller recognized the need for firm but educational guidance. Marcus, that kind of thinking leads to dangerous situations in the wilderness. Bears are most active during dawn and dusk hours, but they can be encountered at any time. More importantly, 40 yards might not provide sufficient escape distance if we surprised a bear near its marked territory. The educational session continued for another 30 minutes, with Sarah Chen covering topics including proper food storage, noise-making techniques for avoiding bear encounters, and appropriate responses if bears were observed. The information, while presented as general wilderness education, carried obvious relevance to their current situation. At 2:30, the Wolverine cabin joined other age-appropriate groups for free activity time, with options including volleyball, board games in the main lodge, or supervised exploration of the camp's nature trail. The nature trail, a 1-mile loop that normally extended into the forest beyond the camp's developed areas, had been shortened to remain within the secure perimeter established by the enhanced protocols. Most Wolverine cabin members chose volleyball, where their competitive spirit and athletic abilities made them formidable opponents against counselors and other cabin groups. However, Marcus Thompson and Alex Brennan expressed preference for exploring the abbreviated nature trail, claiming interest in observing wildlife sign that Sarah Chen had discussed during the educational session. Mason Fuller approved their request with specific conditions. They would remain in visual contact with the main lodge at all times, carry whistle signals for emergency communication, and return immediately if directed by any staff member. Sarah Chen accompanied them as additional supervision, carrying a radio for communication with other staff members and a canister of bear spray as precautionary equipment. The abbreviated nature trail led through stands of mature ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, with occasional clearings that provided views of the surrounding mountains. Spring wildflowers had begun emerging in sunny areas, including early lupine, Indian paintbrush, and mountain columbine. The trail featured interpretive signs describing local flora and fauna, though several signs had been damaged by winter weather and required maintenance attention. Approximately 20 minutes into their hike, Marcus Thompson spotted the soccer ball through the trees, its white panels contrasting sharply with the brown forest floor. The ball lay roughly 60 yards from their position on the abbreviated trail, just beyond a small drainage that marked the boundary between the camp's managed areas and true wilderness. "There it is," Marcus announced, pointing toward the ball. "It's right there, maybe a 2-minute hike off the trail." Alex Brennan, whose extensive mountain experience had developed good judgment about risk assessment, expressed reservations. "It's farther than it looks, and we'd have to cross that drainage. Plus, those trees beyond the drainage show claw marks similar to what we saw near the soccer field this morning." Sarah Chen used binoculars to examine the area around the soccer ball, noting several additional trees with fresh claw marks and what appeared to be a daybed where a large animal had recently rested. The daybed, located in a sheltered area among granite boulders, showed compressed vegetation and several large tracks in the soft earth nearby. "The ball stays where it is," Sarah decided firmly. "There's clear evidence of recent bear activity in that exact area, including what looks like a resting site. Attempting retrieval would be extremely dangerous, especially since bears often return to established daybeds." Marcus Thompson's frustration boiled over. "We're losing equipment because we're afraid of a bear that might not even exist. Those tracks could be from dogs, and the claw marks could be old. I think we're overreacting to normal forest conditions." Sarah Chen recognized the need for clear authority while maintaining educational value. "Marcus, that attitude will get you seriously injured or killed in the wilderness. Professional wildlife managers are trained to distinguish between different species' tracks and sign. What we're seeing indicates a large bear, possibly a grizzly, that has established territory in this immediate area." The mention of grizzly bears captured both boys' attention, as most Colorado residents believed grizzlies had been extinct in the state for decades. Alex Brennan, whose father's aviation business required extensive knowledge of wildlife patterns, expressed surprise at the possibility. "I thought grizzly bears were eliminated from Colorado in the 1950s, Alex said. My dad flies hunters and wildlife photographers throughout the Rockies, and he's never mentioned grizzly sightings." Sarah Chen nodded, acknowledging the common misconception. Official populations were eliminated, but dispersing bears from Wyoming and Montana occasionally enter Colorado. Climate change and habitat pressures are driving more bears southward, and unconfirmed sightings have increased significantly in recent years. The group returned to the main camp without further incident, though Marcus Thompson continued to express frustration about the abandoned soccer ball. His competitive nature and leadership role within the Wolverine cabin made the equipment loss particularly galling, especially since it resulted from the previous evening's disputed penalty kick. At 3:45, Wildlife Officer Rebecca Stanton arrived at Camp Ridgeway in a Colorado Parks and Wildlife Enforcement vehicle. Officer Stanton, 34 years old with 15 years of experience in wildlife management, brought specialized expertise in human-wildlife conflict resolution and large carnivore behavior. Her arrival provided the professional assessment that staff had been awaiting since the morning's discovery of wildlife sign. Officer Stanton's initial examination of the tracks and claw marks confirmed staff concerns about dealing with an unusually large bear. The track measurements, gait patterns, and marking behavior all indicated an animal significantly larger than typical black bears found in Colorado. Most concerning, the territorial markings showed intensity and aggression levels that suggested a mature, dominant animal establishing long-term residence rather than simply passing through the area. Based on the sign I'm seeing, you're dealing with either an exceptionally large black bear or possibly a grizzly bear, Officer Stanton informed Director Patricia Hawthorne and senior staff during a briefing in the main lodge. The track size, claw length, and marking behavior all support that assessment. Patricia Hawthorne felt her stomach tighten at the confirmation of her worst fears. What are our options for managing the situation? We have 63 children on site, and parents are expecting normal camp operations. Officer Stanton consulted her field notes and digital photographs of the wildlife sign. Immediate evacuation isn't necessary, but you need to implement comprehensive safety protocols. No activities beyond visual range of the main lodge, mandatory radio communication for all staff, and immediate notification if any bear is observed. The discussion covered various scenarios and response protocols, including procedures for bear sightings, aggressive behavior, and potential attacks. Officer Stanton emphasized that bears exhibiting territorial behavior near human facilities often required relocation or, in extreme cases, destruction for public safety. However, such decisions required extensive documentation and approval from state wildlife administrators. During the briefing, Jake Morrison raised concerns about the camp's emergency response capabilities in remote terrain. Our communication systems work well within camp boundaries, but we have dead zones in some of the activity areas. If we encounter problems during educational activities or nature walks, response times could be critical. Officer Stanton agreed to remain on site through the evening to assess bear activity patterns and provide additional recommendations. Her presence reassured staff and provided professional expertise for managing the developing situation. However, she also emphasized that long-term solutions might require fundamental changes to camp operations if the bear remained in the area. At 4:30, campers participated in the traditional afternoon snack period, gathering in the main lodge for hot chocolate and Maria Santos's famous oatmeal cookies. The atmosphere remained upbeat despite the enhanced security protocols, as most campers remained unaware of the specific wildlife concerns. Staff maintained normal routines while implementing the enhanced safety measures established during the morning emergency meeting. The Wolverine cabin members used snack time to discuss evening activities and continue debating the previous day's disputed penalty kick. Marcus Thompson, still frustrated about the abandoned soccer ball, proposed organizing a petition to camp administration requesting ball retrieval once the wildlife situation was resolved. His leadership within the cabin group meant that his concerns influenced other members' attitudes and expectations. Timothy Walsh, despite his younger age, offered a different perspective based on his mother's legal background. Maybe we should focus on why the penalty kick was disputed instead of worrying about equipment retrieval. If we can resolve the underlying controversy, the ball becomes less important symbolically. Alex Brennan agreed, suggesting that the dispute reflected deeper competitive tensions between cabin groups rather than simple disagreement about rule interpretation. The Eagle cabin guys have been trash-talking us since the season started. They're probably happy that our ball is stuck in the woods. Following snack time, evening activities proceeded according to modified schedules that kept all groups within the secure perimeter established by enhanced protocols. The traditional campfire program was relocated from the remote amphitheater to the area directly adjacent to the main lodge, where staff could maintain better oversight and communication capabilities. Officer Stanton used the campfire program as an educational opportunity, discussing wildlife safety and proper behavior in bear country. Her presentation balanced necessary caution with age-appropriate information, avoiding unnecessary anxiety while ensuring that campers understood basic safety principles. The program concluded with traditional camp songs and stories, maintaining normal routines despite the unusual circumstances. After lights out at 9:30, senior staff conducted a final briefing with Officer Stanton to review the day's observations and plan for continued monitoring. The briefing revealed that several additional trees beyond the soccer field showed fresh claw marks, and tracks had been discovered near the camp's water intake facility, approximately half a mile upstream on Willow Creek. The pattern suggests systematic territorial establishment, Officer Stanton explained. This bear is claiming the entire drainage as its territory, which puts it in direct conflict with camp operations. Unless it moves on voluntarily, we'll need to consider intervention options. Mason Fuller asked about the likelihood of voluntary departure. How long might a bear remain in territory it's claimed? Are we looking at days, weeks, or potentially the entire camp season? Officer Stanton's expression grew serious. Territorial establishment typically indicates long-term residence, especially for mature males. If this bear has claimed this drainage for mating territory, it could remain through the entire breeding season, which extends into July. The implications of extended bear presence forced Patricia Hawthorne to confront difficult decisions about camp operations. Maintaining enhanced protocols for weeks or months would fundamentally alter the camp experience, while ignoring the threat could result in catastrophic consequences. Insurance coverage, parental expectations, and financial considerations all complicated the decision-making process. Dr. Warren raised medical concerns about extended operations under threat conditions. Heightened stress affects both staff and campers, potentially increasing risks of accidents and medical incidents. We also need to consider psychological impacts of sustained fear and restricted activities. The briefing continued past 11 o'clock, covering scenarios ranging from voluntary bear departure to mandatory evacuation. Officer Stanton agreed to establish motion-activated trail cameras near the marked trees, providing remote monitoring capabilities without requiring dangerous human presence in potential conflict zones. March 18th dawned overcast and humid, with low clouds obscuring the surrounding peaks and drizzle creating muddy conditions throughout the camp. Weather reports indicated a spring storm system approaching from the northwest, with potential for significant precipitation and temporary temperature decreases. Such conditions often influenced wildlife behavior, sometimes making bears more active as they sought shelter and food sources. Mason Fuller began his morning routine earlier than usual, rising at 5:30 to conduct a perimeter inspection before campers awakened. His inspection revealed new tracks near the dining hall dumpster, though proper food storage protocols appeared to have prevented any actual contact with garbage. More concerning, several tracks led toward the Wolverine cabin, approaching within 30 yards of the building before turning back toward the forest. The proximity of bear activity to residential facilities elevated the threat level significantly. Officer Stanton, who had spent the night in the camp's guest quarters, expressed serious concern about the nighttime approach to inhabited areas. Such behavior indicated either unusual curiosity or potential habituation to human presence, both of which increased risks of direct encounters. Bears that approach buildings at night are demonstrating concerning behavior, Officer Stanton informed the emergency staff meeting convened at 6:15. This could indicate food conditioning, territorial assertion, or simple curiosity, but all represent elevated risk levels. Patricia Hawthorne recognized that the situation was escalating beyond normal wildlife management protocols. The combination of territorial marking, unusual size indicators, and nighttime approaches to facilities suggested a dangerous pattern that required immediate attention from state wildlife authorities. During breakfast, served under normal routines despite behind-the-scenes concerns, Marcus Thompson renewed his campaign for soccer ball retrieval. His persistent focus on the abandoned equipment had begun influencing other Wolverine cabin members, creating group pressure for resolution that complicated staff decision-making. "The ball is camp property, and we have a right to retrieve our equipment," Marcus argued during a conversation with Sarah Chen. "If the bear is mostly active at night, a quick daylight retrieval should be relatively safe." Sarah Chen recognized the need for firm educational guidance. "Marcus, that assumption could get you killed. Bears are opportunistic and can be active at any time, especially when they're establishing territory. More importantly, the area around the ball shows clear signs of recent bear activity, including daybeds and marking behavior." Alex Brennan, whose mountain experience provided better risk assessment skills, supported Sarah's position. "My dad always says that equipment can be replaced, but people can't. The ball isn't worth risking someone's safety, especially since wildlife experts are telling us the area is dangerous." The breakfast conversation revealed growing tension within the Wolverine cabin about the abandoned equipment and restricted activities. Several members expressed frustration about modified programming, while others supported the enhanced safety measures. Mason Fuller recognized the need for group unity and leadership to prevent the developing situation from undermining cabin cohesion. Following breakfast, Officer Stanton reviewed overnight data from the trail cameras she had installed the previous evening. The cameras had captured multiple images of a large bear moving through the marked territory, confirming staff observations about the animal's size and behavior patterns. Most dramatically, several photographs showed the bear in clear profile, revealing characteristics that definitively identified it as a grizzly bear rather than an unusually large black bear. The grizzly bear in the photographs measured approximately 8 feet in length and showed the distinctive shoulder hump, dished face profile, and long claws characteristic of the species. Weight estimation based on photographic evidence suggested an animal exceeding 700 pounds, making it a mature, dominant male in prime condition. Most concerning, the bear had investigated the soccer ball extensively, scent marking nearby trees and establishing what appeared to be a temporary territorial marker around the equipment. "We're definitely dealing with a grizzly bear," Officer Stanton announced during an emergency meeting with senior staff. The photographs provide conclusive identification, and this animal represents a significant threat to camp operations. I'm recommending immediate consultation with state wildlife administrators about management options. The confirmation of grizzly presence transformed the situation from routine wildlife management to unprecedented crisis for Colorado's outdoor recreation industry. Grizzly bears had been officially extinct in Colorado since the 1950s, making this animal's presence a matter of statewide significance that would attract media attention and regulatory scrutiny. Patricia Hawthorne felt the weight of historical responsibility settling on her shoulders. Camp Ridgway's response to Colorado's first confirmed grizzly presence in decades would establish precedents for wilderness education throughout the region. Overreacting could damage the outdoor education industry, while underreacting could result in tragedy that would haunt her for the remainder of her career. Dr. Warren expressed immediate concerns about medical preparedness for potential grizzly encounters. Grizzly attacks typically result in more severe injuries than black bear incidents due to the animal's size, strength, and aggressive tendencies. Our medical supplies and evacuation procedures are adequate for black bear encounters, but grizzly incidents often require specialized trauma care. Jake Morrison, drawing on his military experience, suggested implementing defensive positions and escape route planning. We need to treat this like a hostile force situation, establish defensible positions for each cabin group, identify multiple evacuation routes, and ensure all staff understand command structures for emergency response. The emergency meeting extended through the morning activity period, as staff grappled with unprecedented decisions about managing grizzly presence in a developed recreational facility. Officer Stanton contacted state wildlife administrators in Denver, requesting immediate guidance about management protocols and potential intervention strategies. Meanwhile, campers participated in modified activities supervised by assistant counselors, unaware of the dramatic escalation in threat assessment occurring among senior staff. The Wolverine Cabin worked with Tommy Nakamura on wilderness survival skills, learning shelter construction and fire-making techniques that paralleled the emergency preparedness discussions happening in the main lodge. Marcus Thompson continued expressing frustration about equipment retrieval, though his complaints now focused more on restricted activities than specifically on the soccer ball. His natural leadership qualities were beginning to channel into criticism of what he perceived as excessive caution by camp administration, creating potential for group discord that could complicate emergency management. At 10:45, Colorado Parks and Wildlife Director James Mitchell arrived at Camp Ridgway by helicopter, accompanied by grizzly bear specialist Dr. Amanda Rodriguez from Montana State University. Director Mitchell, a political appointee with extensive outdoor recreation background, brought state-level authority for managing the unprecedented situation, while Dr. Rodriguez provided scientific expertise about grizzly behavior and management strategies. The helicopter landing created significant excitement among campers who gathered in the meadow to observe the aircraft's arrival despite staff efforts to maintain normal routines. The dramatic response validated concerns that many campers had begun developing about the wildlife situation, though specific details remained restricted to senior staff and visiting officials. Director Mitchell's briefing with camp leadership revealed the statewide implications of confirmed grizzly presence in Colorado. This animal represents the first confirmed grizzly in Colorado since 1979, making its management a matter of significant public interest and scientific importance. Our response will establish precedents for grizzly management throughout the southern Rocky Mountains. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of the photographic evidence and field sign confirmed that the bear exhibited territorial behavior consistent with mature males establishing breeding territory. This animal appears to be a dispersing male from the Yellowstone population, possibly driven south by competition or habitat pressures. Its behavior indicates intention to remain in this area through the breeding season. The scientific and political implications of grizzly presence created complex decision-making challenges that extended far beyond immediate camp safety. The bear's protected status under the Endangered Species Act limited management options, while public safety concerns demanded decisive action to prevent potential encounters with recreational users. Patricia Hawthorne asked the question that had been troubling her since the situation began. What are our realistic options for managing this situation while maintaining camp operations? Director Mitchell's response reflected the complexity of balancing conservation priorities with public safety. Relocation is difficult for territorial males, and this bear's size makes it dangerous to handle. Lethal control requires extensive justification and federal approval. Our preferred option is habitat modification to encourage voluntary departure, combined with enhanced safety protocols until the animal moves on. Dr. Rodriguez agreed with the habitat modification approach while emphasizing the unpredictability of grizzly behavior. Territorial males can be extremely dangerous during breeding season, especially if they encounter perceived threats or competition. This bear's investigation of human equipment suggests unusual curiosity that could lead to direct encounters. The discussion of management options continued through lunch, with various scenarios evaluated for feasibility and effectiveness. Enhanced safety protocols, while necessary for immediate protection, could not be sustained indefinitely without fundamentally altering the camp experience that parents and children expected from their wilderness education investment. Following lunch, Director Mitchell and Dr. Rodriguez conducted a comprehensive site assessment, examining all wildlife sign and evaluating potential conflict scenarios. Their analysis revealed that the bear had established territorial markers throughout the camp's peripheral areas, creating a situation where normal camp activities directly conflicted with the animal's claimed territory. The territorial boundaries include most of your activity areas, Dr. Rodriguez reported during the afternoon briefing. The archery range, nature trail, and climbing locations all fall within areas that this bear appears to consider its territory. Continuing normal operations would create multiple opportunities for dangerous encounters. Mason Fuller asked about timeline expectations for voluntary departure. If habitat modification is the preferred approach, how long might it take to encourage the bear to move on? Dr. Rodriguez's answer provided little comfort. Territorial establishment by mature males can persist through the entire breeding season, potentially extending into August. There's no guarantee that habitat modification will be effective, especially since this drainage provides ideal grizzly habitat, including water, food sources, and denning opportunities. The implications of extended grizzly presence forced Patricia Hawthorne to confront the possibility of season cancellation or fundamental program modifications. Either option would have catastrophic financial consequences for the camp, while potentially damaging the broader outdoor education industry's reputation for safety management. At 3 o'clock, the situation escalated when Rebecca Martinez reported a bear sighting near the bear cabin during afternoon activities. The sighting occurred approximately 200 yards from the main lodge within the camp's developed area, as the grizzly investigated drying laundry outside the cabin building. Officer Stanton responded immediately with hazing equipment, using noisemakers and rubber bullets to drive the bear away from the residential area. The bear retreated reluctantly, stopping frequently to look back toward the camp, behavior that indicated minimal fear of human presence and potential for return approaches. This animal is showing dangerous habituation patterns, Officer Stanton reported during the emergency response. It's lost appropriate fear responses to human presence, which dramatically increases encounter risks. We need to implement immediate evacuation procedures before someone gets hurt. And Danu, the bear sighting within the camp's developed area, forced Director Mitchell to authorize emergency evacuation protocols despite the complex logistics involved. 63 children and their equipment needed transportation from the remote mountain location to collection points where parents could retrieve them, while staff prepared facilities for potential extended closure. Dr. Warren coordinated medical preparations for the evacuation, ensuring that all campers' medications and medical records were organized for transport. Several campers with chronic conditions required special attention, including Timothy Walsh, who used an inhaler for exercise-induced asthma, and Marcus Thompson, who took medication for attention deficit disorder. The evacuation announcement created significant excitement and disappointment among campers, many of whom had looked forward to the wilderness experience for months. The Wolverine cabin members in particular expressed frustration about losing opportunities for overnight expeditions and advanced outdoor activities that had motivated their enrollment. "This is ridiculous," Marcus Thompson declared during the hurried packing process. "We're letting one bear destroy our entire camp experience. People have been dealing with bears in these mountains for thousands of years without running away every time they see tracks." Alex Brennan, while disappointed about the evacuation, supported the administration's decision based on his family's aviation experience. "My dad says that risk management sometimes requires difficult decisions that disappoint people in the short term, but prevent tragedies that would be much worse." Sarah Chen used the packing time as a final educational opportunity, explaining how grizzly bears differed from black bears in behavior, habitat requirements, and danger levels. Her explanations helped some campers understand why this situation required more dramatic responses than typical black bear encounters that were commonly managed through food storage and noise-making techniques. At 4:30, the first group of parents arrived to collect their children, having driven from Denver, Colorado Springs, and other Front Range communities following emergency notifications. The parking area, normally quiet except during arrival and departure days, bustled with activity as families reunited and equipment was loaded into vehicles. Patricia Hawthorne addressed each family individually, explaining the situation and the factors that had necessitated emergency evacuation. Her explanations balanced honesty about the safety risks with reassurance about the professional management of the crisis, though several parents expressed anger about the disrupted camp experience their children had been promised. "We pay premium fees for wilderness education, and you're sending the kids home because of one bear," demanded Richard Brennan, Alex's father and owner of Summit Helicopter Services. "In my business, we deal with wildlife risks every day without shutting down operations entirely." Patricia's response reflected the weight of responsibility she felt for 63 young lives. "Mr. Brennan, this isn't just one bear. We're dealing with a 700-pound grizzly bear that has established territory encompassing our activity areas and has shown unusual interest in human facilities. The risk of serious injury or death is simply too high to justify continued operations." Other parents expressed more understanding of the difficult decision, recognizing the unprecedented nature of grizzly presence in Colorado and the lack of established protocols for managing such situations. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's medical perspective particularly resonated with parents who understood the limited trauma care capabilities available in remote locations. By 6 o'clock, 47 of the 63 campers had been collected by their families, with arrangements made for the remaining 16 whose parents faced longer travel distances. The normally bustling camp had become eerily quiet, with only essential staff remaining to manage facility security and coordinate with wildlife officials. Mason Fuller and Sarah Chen remained on duty with the Wolverine cabin members whose parents had not yet arrived, including Marcus Thompson, Timothy Walsh, and Alex Brennan. The three boys expressed particular disappointment about the evacuation, as they had been enrolled in the camp's most advanced program and had looked forward to challenging outdoor experiences. "Can we at least retrieve our soccer ball before we leave?" Marcus asked during the evening meal preparation. "If we're evacuating anyway, there's no ongoing risk to camp operations." Mason Fuller recognized the symbolic importance of the request while maintaining necessary safety priorities. "Marcus, the ball is located in the center of the bear's established territory. Attempting retrieval would require venturing into the most dangerous area we've identified, and it could provoke an encounter that puts rescuers at risk." The conversation was interrupted by radio communication from Officer Stanton, who reported fresh tracks near the main lodge dumpster. The bear had approached within 50 yards of the building where the remaining campers and staff were gathered, demonstrating continued investigation of human facilities despite daytime activity levels. At 7:15, Marcus Thompson's parents arrived to collect him, driving from their home in Denver through challenging weather conditions. Dr. Jennifer Thompson, a pediatric surgeon, and her husband Mark, an attorney specializing in outdoor recreation law, expressed understanding of the evacuation decision while sharing their son's disappointment about the truncated experience. "Marcus has been looking forward to this camp session for 8 months, Dr. Thompson explained. He's particularly interested in wilderness survival skills and outdoor leadership opportunities. Is there any possibility of resuming operations if the bear moves on?" Patricia Hawthorne's response reflected the uncertainty surrounding grizzly management in unprecedented circumstances. "We're working with state wildlife officials to develop long-term management strategies. If the bear departs voluntarily or can be safely relocated, we'll consider resuming operations for the remainder of the summer season." Marcus Thompson's departure left Timothy Walsh and Alex Brennan as the final Wolverine cabin members, awaiting family pickup. Both boys had formed friendships during their brief time at camp, and the disrupted experience had created bonds based on shared disappointment and adventure. As evening approached, wildlife activity increased around the camp perimeter. Officer Stanton reported multiple sightings of the grizzly bear investigating various facilities, including approaches to the climbing wall, archery range, and nature trail markers. The animal's persistent interest in human infrastructure suggested potential habituation that would complicate future management efforts. Dr. Rodriguez conducted evening briefings with remaining staff about grizzly behavior patterns and safety protocols. This bear is exhibiting unusual curiosity about human facilities, which could indicate either food conditioning or territorial assertion. Both patterns suggest increased likelihood of direct encounters if operations resumed without significant modifications. At 8:30, Judge Patricia Walsh arrived to collect her son Timothy, having driven from Boulder through deteriorating weather conditions. Judge Walsh, whose federal court experience had developed strong risk assessment skills, expressed appreciation for the camp's handling of the unprecedented situation. "You've made a difficult decision under impossible circumstances," Judge Walsh told Patricia Hawthorne. "Balancing child safety with program expectations requires exactly the kind of conservative judgment you've demonstrated." Timothy Walsh's departure left Alex Brennan as the final camper awaiting pickup, though his father's helicopter business was delayed by weather conditions that prevented safe flight operations. Alex would spend the night at camp with skeleton staff, creating additional security concerns given the bear's increased evening activity. At 9 o'clock, the grizzly bear made its closest approach to the main lodge, investigating the front steps and windows before retreating when Officer Stanton activated hazing equipment. The encounter, observed through night vision equipment, demonstrated the animal's comfort level around human facilities and its persistence in territorial claims. Mason Fuller and Sarah Chen maintained overnight supervision of Alex Brennan, implementing enhanced security protocols that included locked facilities, emergency communication equipment, and immediate evacuation procedures if the bear approached residential areas. The overnight period would test the camp's ability to maintain safety while preparing for extended closure. The night passed without major incidents, though trail cameras documented extensive bear activity throughout the camp perimeter. The grizzly investigated multiple facilities, scent-marked additional trees, and established what appeared to be regular patrol routes that encompassed most of the camp's activity areas. March 19th dawned clear and cold, with overnight temperatures having dropped below freezing and creating icy conditions on exposed surfaces. Weather reports indicated improving conditions that would allow helicopter operations for Alex Brennan's pickup, though the delay had extended his camp experience beyond that of other participants. At 7:30, Richard Brennan arrived by helicopter to collect his son, landing in the meadow southeast of the main lodge under Officer Stanton's supervision. The helicopter's presence created significant noise and disturbance that appeared to affect the grizzly bear's behavior, with tracks indicating the animal had retreated deeper into the forest during the aircraft's approach. This situation demonstrates exactly why we need better wildlife management protocols for recreational areas, Richard Brennan commented during his son's pickup. The outdoor recreation industry can't shut down every time we encounter large predators, especially protected species that are likely to expand their ranges in coming decades. Patricia Hawthorne appreciated his industry perspective while maintaining her position about immediate safety priorities. Mr. Brennan, we're dealing with unprecedented circumstances that require conservative approaches until we develop appropriate protocols. This bear's behavior patterns suggest risks that exceed normal wildlife management parameters. Alex Brennan's departure marked the completion of emergency evacuation procedures, leaving only essential staff to manage facility security and coordinate with wildlife officials. The normally bustling camp had become a ghost town, with empty cabins and silent activity areas, creating an eerie atmosphere that emphasized the dramatic impact of grizzly presence. Following the evacuation completion, Director Mitchell convened final briefings with remaining staff about long-term management strategies. The options remained limited and uncertain, with habitat modification efforts competing against the bear's apparent territorial commitment and the approaching breeding season that could intensify aggressive behavior. We'll maintain facility security through trained personnel while implementing habitat modification techniques, Director Mitchell explained. However, there's no guarantee these efforts will be successful, and resuming operations would require extensive safety protocol modifications that might fundamentally alter the camp experience. Dr. Rodriguez provided scientific context about grizzly territorial behavior and management challenges. This bear has invested significant energy in establishing territory here, and territorial males are notoriously difficult to relocate. The combination of ideal habitat and lack of competition suggests this animal may remain through the entire breeding season. Mason Fuller asked about long-term career implications for staff whose positions depended on successful camp operations. If the bear remains and prevents normal operations, what happens to employment for next season and beyond? Patricia Hawthorne's response reflected the financial uncertainty created by the unprecedented situation. We're exploring insurance coverage and discussing options with our board of directors. The camp's 38-year safety record should support insurance claims, but coverage for wildlife-related closures isn't clearly established in our policies. The final briefing concluded with assignments for ongoing facility security and coordination with wildlife management efforts, Mason Fuller and Bear Johnson would alternate supervisory duties, maintaining essential facilities, while implementing habitat modification techniques designed to encourage voluntary bear departure. Sarah Chen returned to the University of Colorado Boulder to complete her master's degree, though she expressed interest in documenting the camp's experience for her thesis research about human-wildlife conflict management. Her academic background provided valuable perspective about the broader implications of grizzly recovery for outdoor recreation industries. Over the following weeks, Camp Ridgway remained closed while wildlife officials implemented various habitat modification strategies. Motion-activated cameras documented continued grizzly presence, with the animal maintaining regular territorial patrols and showing no indication of voluntary departure. The soccer ball, still lying where it had landed during the disputed penalty kick, became a focal point for the bear's scent-marking behavior. By mid-April, it became apparent that the grizzly had established permanent territory encompassing the camp's operational areas. Director Mitchell authorized consideration of lethal control options, though federal regulations required extensive documentation and approval processes that could extend through the summer season. The closure of Camp Ridgway created ripple effects throughout Colorado's outdoor education industry, as parents and organizations re-evaluated wilderness programs in potential grizzly habitat. Insurance companies began requiring enhanced wildlife protocols for camps operating in areas with confirmed large predator presence, increasing operational costs and program restrictions. Marcus Thompson, disappointed by his truncated camp experience, enrolled in a climbing program in Rocky Mountain National Park, where he eventually encountered a black bear during an overnight expedition. His experience at Camp Ridgway had provided valuable education about wildlife safety that potentially prevented a dangerous situation when he properly stored food and maintained appropriate distances during the encounter. Timothy Walsh used his brief camp experience as inspiration for a school research project about grizzly bear recovery and human-wildlife conflict management. His mother's legal connections provided access to federal court records about Endangered Species Act enforcement, creating educational opportunities that connected his outdoor interests with academic achievement. Alex Brennan's family helicopter business began offering wildlife viewing tours in areas with confirmed grizzly presence, capitalizing on public interest in Colorado's returning bear population. His camp experience provided valuable insights about grizzly behavior that enhanced the safety and educational value of the commercial wildlife viewing operations. On June 15, 2025, 3 months after the initial evacuation, Colorado Parks and Wildlife authorized lethal control of the grizzly bear after it approached a group of hikers on the adjacent National Forest Trail, requiring emergency evacuation by helicopter. The bear was killed by wildlife officers using high-powered rifles, ending its territorial claims but generating significant controversy among conservation groups and outdoor recreation advocates. The necropsy revealed that the bear was a 23-year-old male weighing 743 pounds in excellent health and prime condition. Genetic analysis confirmed its origin from the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, making it a dispersing animal that had traveled over 500 miles to establish territory in Colorado. The animal's stomach contents included remnants of the Camp Ridgway soccer ball, which it had apparently chewed and partially consumed during its territorial marking behavior. Patricia Hawthorne announced Camp Ridgway's permanent closure in August 2025, citing insurance cancellation and liability concerns that made continued operations financially impossible. The camp's facilities were eventually sold to a hunting outfitter who specialized in high-security wilderness experiences for clients seeking authentic outdoor challenges in areas with confirmed large predator presence. Mason Fuller, accepted a position with Colorado Parks and Wildlife as a human-wildlife conflict specialist, using his experience at Camp Ridgway to develop enhanced protocols for managing outdoor recreation in areas with recovering grizzly populations. His expertise proved valuable as additional bears dispersed into Colorado from northern populations, creating ongoing challenges for wilderness tourism and outdoor education. Sarah Chen completed her master's thesis on the Camp Ridgway incident, which became a foundational document for human-wildlife conflict management in the academic literature. Her research demonstrated the complex interactions between wildlife recovery, outdoor recreation economics, and public safety that would characterize grizzly management throughout the southern Rocky Mountains. The abandoned soccer ball, partially consumed by the grizzly bear that had claimed it as a territorial marker, became a symbol of the fundamental changes occurring in Colorado's wilderness as large predators returned to landscapes they had occupied for millennia before human development altered the balance between wildlife and recreation. The ball's fate illustrated the unpredictable consequences of wildlife recovery for human activities that had developed during the absence of large predators. Dr. Rodriguez's research about the Camp Ridgway grizzly contributed to federal recovery planning for grizzly bears in the southern Rocky Mountains, influencing management strategies for the inevitable expansion of grizzly populations into Colorado and New Mexico. The incident provided crucial data about territorial behavior, habitat selection, and human-wildlife conflict patterns that would guide future conservation efforts. The Camp Ridgway incident established legal precedents for liability and insurance coverage related to wildlife encounters in recreational facilities, influencing industry standards and regulatory requirements throughout the Mountain West. Patricia Hawthorne's conservative decision-making became a model for risk management in unprecedented circumstances, even though it ultimately resulted in business closure. Years later, Marcus Thompson, Timothy Walsh, and Alex Brennan would occasionally correspond about their brief but memorable experience at Camp Ridgway, sharing updates about their outdoor adventures and careers, influenced by those dramatic March days. Their shared experience of witnessing Colorado's first confirmed grizzly in decades created lasting bonds and shaped their understanding of humanity's complex relationship with wilderness and wildlife. The site that had once been Camp Ridgway gradually returned to wild conditions, with buildings deteriorating and forest reclaiming the developed areas. Grizzly bears from expanding northern populations occasionally passed through the drainage, following ancient migration routes that predated human settlement by thousands of years. The location remained a reminder of the profound changes occurring in western landscapes as large predators returned to territories where they had once been eliminated. The soccer ball incident, as it came to be known in wildlife management circles, influenced policy discussions about outdoor recreation in recovering ecosystems throughout North America. The case study demonstrated how single wildlife encounters could cascade into industry-wide changes, affecting everything from insurance regulations to parent expectations about wilderness education safety. Conservation organizations used the Camp Ridgway closure as evidence of the economic costs associated with wildlife recovery, arguing for enhanced funding for human-wildlife conflict management and compensation programs for businesses affected by conservation successes. The incident became a rallying point for discussions about balancing wildlife recovery with traditional human land uses. The grizzly bear that had claimed the drainage containing Camp Ridgway left a complex legacy extending far beyond its physical presence in the Colorado mountains. Its territorial behavior had demonstrated the inevitable conflicts arising as large predators recolonized landscapes developed during their absence, while its ultimate fate illustrated the difficult decisions required when wildlife recovery conflicts with human safety and economic interests. The story of Camp Ridgway served as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of successful conservation efforts, reminding policymakers and outdoor professionals that wildlife recovery creates new challenges requiring innovative solutions. The incident influenced everything from summer camp protocols to federal endangered species management, demonstrating how individual wildlife encounters can reshape entire industries and regulatory frameworks. Mason Fuller's experience as head counselor during the crisis became the foundation for a new career in human-wildlife conflict management, eventually leading to his appointment as Colorado's first grizzly bear recovery coordinator when the state formally acknowledged the return of the species. His first-hand experience with grizzly territorial behavior provided crucial insights for developing coexistence strategies that would accommodate both wildlife recovery and human recreation in shared landscapes. The evacuation of Camp Ridgway marked the end of an era in Colorado outdoor education, representing the last time that wilderness programs could operate under the assumption that large predators remained absent from the landscape. Future generations of campers and counselors would need to develop new skills and protocols for coexisting with grizzly bears, fundamentally altering the relationship between humans and wilderness in the southern Rocky Mountains. The legacy of the soccer ball, partially consumed by a grizzly bear defending territory it had claimed through ancient instincts, symbolized the collision between human recreation and wildlife recovery that would characterize conservation challenges throughout the 21st century. The simple piece of sports equipment had become the focal point for one of the most significant human-wildlife conflicts in Colorado history, ultimately influencing policy and practice throughout the region. As grizzly bears continued expanding their range southward from Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks, driven by climate change and population growth, the lessons learned at Camp Ridgway would prove increasingly relevant for outdoor recreation providers throughout the Mountain West. The incident established protocols and legal precedents that would guide similar situations in the decades to come, when grizzly encounters would become routine rather than unprecedented events in Colorado's wilderness areas. The next stories. The Last Trail. The Last Trail. The first mistake Sarah Matheson made was trusting the weather forecast. The National Weather Service had predicted 3 days of perfect autumn weather, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s during the day, dropping to the 40s at night. Perfect conditions for their long-planned family camping trip into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. But the meteorologists hadn't accounted for the early cold front moving down from Canada, bringing with it the kind of weather that would drive every large predator in western Montana into a feeding frenzy as they prepared for an unexpectedly early winter. Sarah stood at the kitchen window of their ranch house, watching the thermometer on the back deck register 38 degrees at 7 in the morning. Frost covered the wooden rails, and the last of her summer flowers hung black and wilted in their planters. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic as she watched her breath fog the glass. The second mistake was believing her family could handle 3 days in the Bitterroot Wilderness without a satellite communicator. David had argued against the expense, insisting that cell towers were being built all through the National Forest system and that they'd probably have signal most of the way. He'd been wrong about that, as Sarah suspected he would be, but by the time they discovered the truth, it would be far too late. The third mistake was more subtle, but equally fatal, trusting David's research about grizzly behavior. Her husband was a thorough man, the kind of attorney who left nothing to chance in the courtroom, and he'd spent months preparing for this trip. He'd read books, watched documentaries, even attended a wilderness safety seminar in Missoula. But all of his research had focused on normal bear behavior, the kind of encounters that happened 99% of the time. He hadn't learned about the 1%, the rogue bears, the old males pushed out of prime territory, the predators that had learned to associate humans with food. The fourth and final mistake was thinking they knew enough about grizzly bears to venture into the heart of their territory during late September, when the massive predators were in hyperphagia, the feeding frenzy that preceded hibernation. Every bear in western Montana was consuming up to 20,000 calories per day, and the early frost had destroyed much of their natural food supply. Berries that should have been fat and sweet were shriveled and tasteless. Fish runs were smaller than usual. The bears were hungry, desperate, and running out of time before winter's arrival. But Sarah didn't know about any of these mistakes yet as she stood at the kitchen window, watching frost glitter on the wooden deck rails like scattered diamonds. Behind her, she could hear the familiar sounds of her family preparing for adventure. David's methodical packing, Emma's protests about leaving her phone behind, Jake's excited chatter about seeing wildlife. These were the sounds of normalcy, of a suburban family preparing for a camping trip that thousands of other families took every year without incident. "Mom, have you seen my good hiking boots?" Emma called from upstairs, her voice carrying the particular tone of teenage exasperation that Sarah had come to recognize as Emma's default mode of communication. "Check the mudroom," Sarah called back, still watching the frost slowly melt in the strengthening sunlight. "And bring a warmer sleeping bag than you planned. It's colder than the forecast predicted." David emerged from the garage carrying an armload of camping gear, his breath steaming in the cold air. At 45, he maintained the athletic build that had made him a star quarterback at the University of Montana 25 years earlier, though his hairline had receded and his temples had gone silver. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge, whether in a courtroom or planning a family adventure. "Perfect morning for a drive into the mountains," he announced, loading sleeping bags into the back of their Ford Explorer. "Temperature's supposed to warm up to 65 by noon." Sarah turned from the window, studying her husband's face for any sign of doubt. She'd been married to David Carlson for 17 years, long enough to recognize the subtle signs when he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The slight tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw muscles tensed when he smiled, these were tells that would have served her well in negotiations had she been facing him across a conference table instead of living with him. "The thermometer says 38 degrees right now," she pointed out. "That's 30 degrees colder than the forecast." Weather's unpredictable in the mountains," David replied with a shrug that was meant to look casual. "That's why we packed for all conditions. We'll be fine, Sarah. I've been planning this trip for months." And he had been planning it, Sarah admitted to herself. Their dining room table had been covered with topographical maps for weeks, marked with colored pens to show elevation changes, water sources, and potential camping sites. David had researched the area's history, studied wildlife patterns, and even contacted local Forest Service rangers for advice. He'd approached their camping trip with the same methodical thoroughness that had made him one of Missoula's most successful defense attorneys. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that all of David's preparation was based on the assumption that nature would cooperate with his plans. She'd grown up in suburban Seattle, where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional raccoon in the garbage, and even after 17 years in Montana, she'd never fully adjusted to the state's vast emptiness. The idea of being miles from the nearest road, with no cell service and no way to call for help, filled her with a low-level anxiety that she'd learned to hide from her family. "Emma, Jake, come help load the car," David called toward the house. "We want to be on the trail by 10:30. Their 16-year-old daughter emerged from the house carrying a backpack that looked like it could supply a small army. Emma had inherited her father's methodical nature and her mother's worry gene. resulting in a teenager who overpacked for every occasion. She'd been excited about the camping trip for weeks, seeing it as a chance to bond with her family before the chaos of college applications consumed her senior year. But this morning, something in the air, the unexpected cold perhaps, or her parents' barely concealed tension, had dampened her enthusiasm. "Dad, I checked the weather on my phone before it died," she said, hefting her pack into the back of the Explorer. "There's a winter storm warning for the higher elevations. Maybe we should postpone this for a few weeks." "Weather services are always overly cautious," David replied, though Sarah noticed he avoided meeting Emma's eyes. "We're not going that high, and it's only 3 days. By the time any serious weather hits, we'll be home watching it from our living room." Jake bounded out of the house with the unleashed energy of a 13-year-old boy who'd been promised adventure. He was small for his age, all elbows and knees and uncontrolled enthusiasm, and he idolized his father in the way that only a young son could. If David had suggested they hike to the moon, Jake would have packed his sleeping bag and asked when they were leaving. "Are we really going to see bears?" he asked for the 100th time, bouncing on his toes as he waited for his father's attention. "I mean, actual wild bears, not just in a zoo." "Possibly," David said, ruffling his son's hair. "But remember what we talked about. If we see a bear, we make ourselves big, speak in calm voices, and back away slowly. Bears are more afraid of us than we are of them." Sarah caught Emma's eye and saw her own skepticism reflected there. Emma had done her own research about grizzly bears for a school report the previous year, and she knew that David's statement, while technically true most of the time, came with significant exceptions. Old male bears, bears with cubs, bears protecting food sources, bears that had been habituated to human presence, all of these could be far more dangerous than David's simplified advice suggested. "I still think we should have rented a satellite communicator," Sarah said, as she loaded her own pack into the car. "Just in case." "Honey, we've been through this," David replied, with the patient tone he used when he thought she was being irrational. "We're going to established camping areas on well-marked trails. People take this exact trip dozens of times every year without any problems. The only danger is that we might get bored watching Jake try to catch fish with his bare hands." The drive to the trailhead took them through increasingly wild country, past ranches that grew more isolated and sparse as they climbed into the foothills. Sarah watched the landscape change outside her window, from the broad valleys around Missoula with their neat fields and suburban developments to the narrow canyons and dense forests that marked the beginning of true wilderness. Cell phone service had disappeared somewhere around mile marker 37, and she'd felt her stomach tighten when the last bar on her phone finally winked out. "Look at this place," David said as they wound through a narrow canyon where Willow Creek ran parallel to the road. Untouched wilderness for hundreds of square miles. This is what Montana looked like when Lewis and Clark first saw it. Emma looked up from her dead phone with interest, despite herself. "Do you think they were scared? Lewis and Clark, I mean. Going into completely unknown territory with no backup plan." "They were explorers," David replied. "Fear was just part of the job. Besides, they had each other just like we do." But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving the modern world behind, in a way that was more permanent than David realized. The houses grew more scattered and then disappeared entirely. The road became a narrow ribbon of gravel, winding through dense forest. And everywhere around them, the wilderness pressed close with an intensity that seemed almost alive. At one point, about 20 miles from their destination, they passed a makeshift memorial beside the road, a simple wooden cross surrounded by wilted flowers and a few stuffed animals. David slowed the car but didn't stop, and Sarah found herself wondering what tragedy the memorial marked. Car accident? Hunting accident? Or something worse? "What do you think happened there?" Jake asked, craning his neck to look back at the cross as they drove past. "Probably just a car accident," David said quickly. "Mountain roads can be dangerous, especially in winter." But Emma had noticed the details that her father had missed. The way the memorial was positioned, not near a dangerous curve or steep drop-off, but beside a section of road that ran through dense forest. The stuffed animals were chosen with care, teddy bears, but also toy wolves, and even a small stuffed grizzly bear. And the flowers, though wilted now, had been carefully arranged by someone who clearly returned to tend them regularly. "I don't think it was a car accident," Emma said quietly, but she didn't elaborate, and the family drove the rest of the way in contemplative silence. The Willow Creek trailhead was nothing more than a gravel parking area carved out of the forest, with a weathered wooden sign and a brown metal box containing wilderness permits. But even this minimal human presence felt comforting after the isolation of the drive, and Sarah was relieved to see 3 other vehicles already parked there, proof that they weren't completely alone in the wilderness. As they unloaded their gear, Sarah studied the other vehicles for clues about their owners. A red Subaru with Colorado plates and a rear window covered in hiking and climbing stickers. Probably experienced outdoor enthusiasts. A white pickup truck with Montana plates and bumper stickers advertising hunting guides and gun shops, locals who knew the area. And a blue Honda Civic with Washington plates that looked distinctly out of place in the wilderness setting. Its pristine paint and lack of outdoor gear suggesting owners who might be as inexperienced as she felt. "Lot of people heading into the backcountry," David observed, shouldering his massive backpack with a grunt. "That's good. Means the trails are well maintained and the areas considered safe." But as they were making their final preparations, an older man emerged from the forest trail, heavily laden with camping equipment and moving with the careful gait of someone who'd been hiking for several days. His weathered face and confident stride marked him as someone who'd spent considerable time in the wilderness, and he approached their group with the easy familiarity of experienced outdoors people who understood the importance of sharing information. "You folks heading up to Copper Lake?" he asked, adjusting the straps on his backpack with the automatic motions of long practice. "That's the plan," David replied, extending his hand in greeting. "David Carlson. This is my wife Sarah and our kids Emma and Jake." "Tom Hendricks," the man replied, shaking David's hand with a grip that spoke of years of manual labor. "I've been coming up here for 20 years, and I've got to tell you, this area's got some unusual activity right now. Saw some fresh grizzly sign yesterday morning about 4 miles up the trail. Big tracks, recent scat, and claw marks on trees that were 8 feet off the ground." Sarah felt her stomach tighten into a familiar knot of anxiety. "How recent is recent?" Tom's expression grew serious as he studied the family group, noting Emma's expensive hiking gear that looked like it had never been used, Jake's excited bounce that marked him as a wilderness novice, and Sarah's barely concealed nervousness. "Within the last 24 hours, I'd say. Maybe less. And this isn't just any bear we're talking about. The tracks were huge, bigger than any I've seen in 2 decades of hiking these mountains. We're talking about a mature boar, probably 400 pounds or more." David's confidence flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "We're well prepared for bear encounters. Everyone has bear spray. We know the food storage protocols, and I've got backup protection if needed." He patted the concealed pistol under his jacket, though he didn't mention it directly. Tom nodded but didn't look entirely reassured. "That's good, but let me tell you what makes me nervous about this particular bear. The sign I found wasn't along game trails or near natural food sources. It was following the human trail, checking out camping spots where people had stayed recently. That's not normal behavior for a wild grizzly. Usually they go out of their way to avoid human scent." "What does that mean?" Emma asked, and Sarah was grateful that her daughter had asked the question she was afraid to voice. could mean a few different things, Tom replied carefully. Sometimes old males get pushed out of prime territory by younger bears and have to scavenge for survival. Sometimes it means the bear has had positive encounters with humans before, meaning someone fed it or left food where it could get to it. And sometimes, he paused, choosing his words carefully, sometimes it means the bear has learned to associate humans with food in a more direct way. The implication hung in the air between them, and Sarah saw David's jaw muscles tense as he processed what Tom was suggesting. Are you saying this bear might be a man-eater? I'm saying this bear is exhibiting behavior that's outside the normal range, Tom replied diplomatically. Could be innocent, could be something more serious. But I'll tell you what I told the Forest Service when I reported it. People heading into that area need to be extra careful about food storage and camping protocols. As if summoned by their conversation, a Forest Service pickup truck pulled into the parking area, and a ranger in his 30s climbed out. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, and he approached their group with the brisk efficiency of someone dealing with an ongoing problem. "Tom, glad I caught you," the ranger said, extending his hand. "I'm Jim Rodriguez, District Ranger. I understand you've been tracking our problem bear." Tom nodded grimly. "Fresh sign all along the drainage system, Jim. He's not staying in one area like a normal grizzly. He's covering a lot of territory, and he's specifically investigating human camping sites." Rodriguez turned to the Carlson family, his expression serious. "I'm going to have to ask you folks to reconsider your camping plans. We've had 3 separate reports of unusual bear behavior in the area you're planning to visit, and we're considering a temporary closure." David's investment in the trip, weeks of planning, expensive gear, time off work, and most importantly his promise to his family of an adventure they'd never forget, made him resistant to changing plans now. What exactly are we talking about here? Aggressive behavior, bluff charges, property damage? "All of the above," Rodriguez replied. "Plus some things that are harder to categorize. 2 different groups have reported being followed by a large grizzly for extended distances. Not just parallel tracking, but actual stalking behavior. And yesterday we had a report of a bear that approached an occupied campsite during daylight hours and showed no fear response to human voices or noisemakers." Emma and Jake exchanged worried glances, and Sarah could see that her children were beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation. But David remained focused on the technicalities, the lawyer in him looking for loopholes in the ranger's concerns. "Has anyone actually been hurt?" he asked. "Because if this is just precautionary—" "Not yet," Rodriguez interrupted. "But Mr. Carlson, I've been working these mountains for 8 years, and I've never seen behavior like this from a wild grizzly. The bear we're tracking isn't just unafraid of humans, it's actively investigating them. That's the kind of behavior that typically precedes a serious incident." Tom shifted his heavy pack and prepared to continue his hike to the parking area. Before leaving, he looked directly at Sarah, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who understood the gravity of their situation. "Mom, I don't want to scare you, but I've been hunting and hiking in grizzly country my whole life, and I've never seen sign like what I found up there. If it was my family, I'd find somewhere else to camp this weekend." After Tom and Ranger Rodriguez left, the Carlson family stood in the parking area facing a decision that would determine whether they lived or died over the next 3 days. David was clearly torn between his careful planning and the mounting evidence that their trip might be more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Sarah wanted to voice her concerns more strongly, but she also knew that appearing overly anxious might trigger David's protective instincts in a way that would make him more determined to prove the trip was safe. "What do you kids think?" David asked, trying to present the decision as a family discussion rather than his alone to make. Jake, despite the warnings they'd just received, was still bouncing with excitement at the prospect of adventure. "I want to see a bear," he said. "Not like get eaten by one or anything, but just see one. How many kids get to say they saw a real wild grizzly bear?" Emma was more thoughtful, her teenage mind capable of processing the adult's concerns in a way that Jake couldn't. "Dad, if the rangers are worried enough to consider closing the area, maybe we should listen to them. We could find somewhere else to camp." "All the other good sites will be taken," David replied. "And we've been planning this specific trip for months. Besides, we're as prepared as anyone could be. We've got bear spray, proper food storage, and we know the safety protocols." Sarah recognized the tone in her husband's voice, the same stubborn determination that made him effective in the courtroom, but sometimes dangerous in real life. David had made up his mind to proceed with the trip, and he was now looking for reasons to justify the decision rather than reconsidering it. "The ranger said they were considering a closure," she pointed out, "not that the area was actually closed." "Exactly," David said, seizing on her words as support for his position. "If it were truly dangerous, they would have closed it already. They're just being cautious, which I appreciate, but we can be cautious too." And so the decision was made, not through careful deliberation of the risks and benefits, but through the kind of incremental rationalization that leads families into danger every year. David convinced himself that his preparation and the family's caution would be sufficient to handle whatever challenges they might face. Sarah convinced herself that her husband's confidence was based on knowledge rather than wishful thinking. Emma convinced herself that her parents wouldn't put the family at risk without good reason. And Jake, at 13, was simply excited about the adventure ahead. They signed the wilderness permits and started up the trail at 10:45 in the morning, later than David had planned, but still early enough to reach Copper Lake with plenty of daylight for setting up camp. The trail began as a gentle climb through dense forest, but the character of the woods struck Sarah as different from what she'd expected. The trees were too quiet, the understory too empty of the small animals that should have been active on a warm September morning. "It's really quiet up here," Emma observed, echoing her mother's thoughts. "Where are all the squirrels and chipmunks?" David, who was leading the group, paused to consult his GPS unit. "Probably just the time of day. Animals are more active in early morning and evening." But Tom Hendricks could have told them that the absence of small animals was often a sign of predator activity, that squirrels and chipmunks went silent and stayed hidden when something dangerous was moving through their territory. The forest's unusual quiet was actually one of the first warnings that Scarface was nearby, but the Carlson family didn't know enough about wilderness signs to recognize it. The trail climbed steadily through old-growth forest, dominated by Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, their massive trunks creating cathedral-like spaces between the trees. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a beautiful hike through some of the most pristine wilderness in North America, but as they climbed higher, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly tense, jumping at every snapped twig or rustle in the underbrush. About 2 miles up the trail, they encountered their first concrete evidence that Tom Hendricks' warnings had been justified. A small creek crossed the trail, and in the soft mud beside the water were bear tracks that made Sarah's blood run cold. They were enormous, each paw print nearly the size of a dinner plate, with claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the toe pads and gouging deep furrows in the earth. David knelt beside the tracks, using his hand for scale as he studied their depth and clarity. "Fresh," he murmured, loud enough for Sarah to hear, but quiet enough that the children wouldn't be alarmed. "Maybe a few hours old." But Emma had approached behind them and gasped when she saw the massive prints. "Dad, those are huge. How big would a bear have to be to make tracks like that?" David stood slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to check the bear spray clipped to his belt. A big one, maybe 400 pounds, possibly more. He tried to keep his voice casual and educational rather than worried. Probably a mature male. They get quite large in this part of Montana. Jake had discovered the tracks as well, and was staring at them with the fascination of a 13-year-old boy who didn't fully grasp the implications of what he was seeing. Are they bigger than the tracks in our bear book? The bear book was a field guide David had purchased as part of his trip preparation, filled with photographs and illustrations that were designed to educate rather than frighten. The tracks beside the creek were easily twice the size of anything in the guide, and David realized with growing unease that his research might have been inadequate for the reality they were facing. "These are from a particularly large bear," he said carefully. "But remember, size doesn't necessarily mean aggression. Large bears are often less aggressive because they don't feel threatened by potential competitors." It was a reasonable theory based on David's research, but it failed to account for the specific circumstances they were facing. Scarface wasn't behaving aggressively because he felt threatened. He was behaving aggressively because 20 years of survival in the wilderness had taught him that humans were potential food sources, and the early frost had made him desperate enough to take risks that a well-fed bear would avoid. They resumed their hike with heightened awareness, David calling out, "Hey bear," every few minutes as he'd learned in the wilderness safety seminar. The calls echoed through the forest without response, but Sarah noticed that even the normal sounds of the woods seemed muted, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. The trail grew steeper as they climbed toward the alpine zone, and the character of the forest began to change. The massive old-growth trees gave way to smaller lodgepole pines and Douglas firs that had colonized areas cleared by avalanches and forest fires. These natural meadows offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks, but also made Sarah feel exposed, like they were being watched by something hidden in the tree line. It was in one of these meadows, about 4 miles from the trailhead, that they encountered the other hikers from the parking area. A young couple was resting beside a cluster of granite boulders, their packs and equipment marking them as experienced backcountry travelers. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with the lean, weathered build of someone who spent serious time outdoors. Her male companion was older, perhaps early 30s, and was favoring his left leg in a way that suggested a recent injury. "Mind if we join you for a few minutes?" David called as they approached. The couple waved them over with the camaraderie that exists among people sharing the challenges of wilderness travel. "Please do," the woman replied, making room on a sun-warmed boulder. "I'm Rebecca Torres, and this is my partner Mark Chen. Are you folks heading up to Copper Lake?" "That's the plan," David said, gratefully shrugging off his heavy pack. "I'm David Carlson. This is my wife Sarah and our kids Emma and Jake. Beautiful morning for a hike." Rebecca and Mark exchanged a look that David didn't quite catch, but Sarah noticed it immediately. It was the kind of glance that passed between people who had been discussing something serious before being interrupted. "Have you been up in this area before?" Rebecca asked carefully. "First time," David replied. "I've been researching it for months, though. Supposed to be some of the most pristine wilderness in Montana." "It is," Mark said, adjusting his position to take weight off his injured leg. "But there's been some unusual activity lately. We actually came up here to document it." Emma looked up with interest. "What kind of unusual activity?" Rebecca hesitated before answering, clearly weighing how much information to share with a family that included young children. "I'm a graduate student in wildlife biology at Colorado State University. Mark's a photographer. We've been tracking reports of abnormal bear behavior in this drainage system. We heard about that from Tom Hendricks at the trailhead," Sarah said, "and from the ranger. They seemed pretty concerned." "They should be," Mark replied grimly. We actually saw the bear yesterday afternoon, about a mile up from here. I was trying to get photographs for documentation when he suddenly focused on us in a way that was unsettling. What do you mean by focused? David asked, his attorney's instincts demanding specific details. Rebecca answered with the precision of a scientist. Normal grizzly behavior when encountering humans is to either flee immediately or engage in threat displays, bluff charges, vocalizations, making themselves appear larger. This bear did none of those things. He simply stopped what he was doing and stared at us with what I can only describe as calculation. How long did this go on? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. About 10 minutes, Mark replied. We followed standard protocols, made ourselves appear large, spoke in calm voices, backed away slowly. But the bear followed us. Not aggressively, just followed, like he was evaluating us. Emma had gone pale during this conversation. That doesn't sound normal. It's not, Rebecca confirmed. We've been studying grizzly behavior for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like it. The bear wasn't displaying territorial aggression or protective behavior. It was predatory assessment. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Are you saying this bear was considering hunting you? I'm saying the bear was exhibiting behavior consistent with predatory interest, Rebecca replied carefully, which is extremely rare in grizzlies. They're omnivores, but they very rarely view adult humans as potential prey. What makes this bear different? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know. Mark and Rebecca exchanged another look before Mark answered. Age, for one thing. The local rangers call him Scarface because of old scars on his muzzle, probably from trap injuries or fights with other bears. He's estimated to be at least 20 years old, which makes him ancient by grizzly standards. Old males often get pushed out of prime territory by younger bears and have to become more opportunistic in their feeding. Plus the food shortage, Rebecca added. The early frost killed most of the berry crops that bears depend on for pre-hibernation feeding. Fish runs have been smaller than normal because of the drought. The bears are desperate to put on fat before winter, and some of them are taking risks they normally wouldn't consider. Jake had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention that children reserve for discussions about things that might eat them. So the bear is hungry and he thinks people might be food. It's more complicated than that, Rebecca replied gently. But yes, in simple terms, that's one possibility we have to consider. David was processing this information through the filter of legal risk assessment, weighing probabilities and considering options. What are the chances of actually encountering this bear? I mean, statistically speaking. Higher than normal, Mark admitted. The rangers have had 5 separate reports of sightings in this drainage system over the past 2 weeks. That's unusual concentration for a solitary animal with a territory that normally covers dozens of square miles. He's not wandering randomly, Rebecca added. He's systematically working this area, hitting all the natural food sources and investigating human activity sites. If you're camping at Copper Lake, there's a reasonable chance you'll encounter him. Sarah looked at her family, Emma trying to appear braver than she felt, Jake wide-eyed with a mixture of fear and excitement, David calculating odds and options with the methodical approach that had made him successful in his profession. They were miles from their car, further still from any help, and they were discussing the possibility of being stalked by a 400-pound predator that had learned to view humans as potential food. Maybe we should reconsider our plans, she said quietly. David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the pristine wilderness that stretched in all directions around them. He'd invested so much in this trip, not just money and time, but emotional capital. He'd promised his family an adventure they'd never forget, a chance to bond before Emma left for college, and their family dynamic changed forever. The thought of turning back now, of disappointing his children and validating Sarah's anxiety, felt like failure. "We're well prepared," he said finally. "We've got bear spray, we know the food storage protocols, and we'll be extra careful about making noise and keeping a clean camp. Thousands of people camp in grizzly country every year without incident." "That's true," Rebecca agreed. "But most of those people aren't dealing with a bear that's exhibiting predatory interest in humans." Mark shifted uncomfortably on his rock seat. "Look, I don't want to scare you or tell you what to do, but if it was my family, especially with kids that age," he gestured toward Emma and Jake, "I'd find somewhere else to camp this weekend." After Rebecca and Mark continued on their way toward the trailhead, the Carlson family sat in the mountain meadow facing a decision that would determine the course of the rest of their lives. The sun was warm on their faces. The views were spectacular, and under normal circumstances, it would have been a perfect day for a family adventure. But the warnings they'd received had cast a shadow over their plans that even David couldn't entirely ignore. "What does everyone think?" he asked, trying to present it as a group decision while hoping his family would support his desire to continue. Emma was torn between her excitement about the trip and her growing awareness that they might be facing genuine danger. "The people who know about bears seem pretty worried," she said carefully. "Maybe we could camp somewhere closer to the road." "All the good sites near the trailhead will be taken by now," David replied, "and we've come this far. It seems like a waste to turn back because of a possibility that we might see a bear." Jake, at 13, was primarily excited by the prospect of adventure and didn't fully grasp the implications of what the adults had been discussing. "I want to keep going," he said. "How many kids get to say they camped in a place where there might be grizzly bears?" Sarah was the deciding vote, and she knew it. Her family was looking to her for guidance, and she had to weigh her maternal instincts against her desire not to be the one who ruined their long-planned adventure. David's confidence was reassuring, and their precautions did seem adequate for dealing with normal bear encounters. "If we're really careful about everything," she said slowly, "and if we stick to all the safety protocols, maybe it will be okay." And so, for the second time that morning, the decision was made to continue. Not because the risk had been carefully evaluated and found acceptable, but because each family member found their own reasons to rationalize proceeding with their original plan. They resumed hiking just after noon, climbing steadily through forest that grew more dense and primeval with each mile. The character of the woods continued to strike Sarah as unusually quiet, but she attributed it to the time of day rather than recognizing it as a sign of predator activity. They saw very few signs of wildlife, no squirrels chattering in the trees, no birds calling from the underbrush, no deer tracks in the soft earth beside the trail. The final 2 miles to Copper Lake were the most challenging, with the trail switchbacking steeply up the side of a granite ridge before dropping down into the alpine basin where the lake waited. By the time they crested the ridge and got their first view of their destination, they were all exhausted and looking forward to setting up camp and resting. Copper Lake was everything David had promised. A pristine alpine jewel nestled in a cirque of granite peaks, its water so clear that they could see fallen logs and rocky shelves 40 feet below the surface. A small meadow on the lake's eastern shore provided the perfect camping spot, with level ground for their tents and a spectacular view across the water to the imposing peaks beyond. But as beautiful as it was, the lake felt isolated in a way that made Sarah increasingly nervous. They were now 8 miles from their car and 12 miles from the nearest paved road. Cell phone service was non-existent, and if something went wrong, they would be entirely dependent on their own resources for survival. They set up camp with the methodical efficiency that David had drilled into them during practice sessions in their backyard, each family member knowing exactly what their responsibilities were. The two tents, a larger one for David and Sarah, a smaller one for the kids, were positioned 30 yards from their cooking area and even farther from where they would hang their food for the night. David had brought 60 feet of parachute cord specifically for food storage, and he spent nearly an hour finding the perfect tree with a suitable branch configuration. The bag containing all their food, toiletries, and anything else with a scent would be suspended 12 feet off the ground and at least 4 feet from the nearest tree trunk, high enough that even a large bear couldn't reach it, and positioned so that climbing the tree wouldn't help. As evening approached and they prepared their first dinner over a small camp stove, the family began to relax and enjoy the spectacular setting. Emma admitted that the hike had been worth the effort, and even Sarah found herself appreciating the absolute silence and pristine beauty of their surroundings. They were completely alone in one of the most beautiful places on earth, and for long stretches of time, they forgot about the warnings they'd received and simply enjoyed being together. But as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks and darkness began to settle over the lake, Sarah found her anxiety returning. Every shadow beyond their small circle of firelight seemed to hold potential menace, and the normal sounds of the forest, an owl hooting in the distance, the splash of a fish jumping in the lake, the rustle of wind in the trees, all seemed amplified and somehow threatening. "Did you hear that?" she asked during a lull in conversation, her head tilted toward the forest behind their camp. The family fell silent, listening intently to the night sounds around them. For several seconds, there was nothing but the crackle of their small campfire and the gentle lap of water against the shoreline. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp, came a sound that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. A low, rumbling grunt that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "Bear," David whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward the concealed pistol under his jacket. "Everyone stay calm. Stay close together." Steam rose from her coffee cup as she surveyed the Carlson family ranch house behind them, a sprawling log structure worth over $1 million that David's successful law practice had afforded them. The house sat on 200 acres of pristine wilderness 30 miles outside Missoula, backed up against national forest land that stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles. "Emma, get your bear spray checked one more time," Sarah called to their 16-year-old daughter, who was arguing with her 13-year-old brother Jake about playlist privileges for the drive. Emma rolled her eyes with the practiced expertise of a teenager, but dutifully retrieved the canister from her pack. David Carlson emerged from the house carrying the last of their food supplies, his graying temples catching the morning light. At 45, he maintained the build of the college athlete he'd once been, though 20 years of courtroom work had softened his edges. "Weather looks perfect for the next 3 days," he announced, consulting his phone. "Clear skies, temperatures in the 60s. Couldn't ask for better conditions." Their destination was a remote section of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, accessible only by a grueling 8-mile hike from the nearest Forest Service road. David had been planning this trip for months, poring over topographical maps and researching the area's history. It was supposed to be their family's grand adventure before Emma left for college, a chance to disconnect from technology and reconnect with each other. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that they were driving away from their fortress-like ranch house with its reinforced doors and security system to sleep in nylon tents in one of the most dangerous wilderness areas in North America. But David had convinced her that the risks were manageable with proper precautions. They'd all taken wilderness safety courses, they carried bear spray, and David had even purchased a .44 Magnum revolver, though he'd never mentioned that last detail to Sarah. The drive to the trailhead took 2 hours through increasingly wild country. Ponderosa pines gave way to Douglas fir and lodgepole pine as they climbed into the mountains. Cell service disappeared somewhere around mile marker 37, and Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety that always accompanied true isolation. She'd grown up in suburban Seattle and never quite adjusted to Montana's vast emptiness, even after 15 years of marriage to David. "Look at that," Jake said, pressing his face against the window as they passed a meadow where a small herd of elk grazed in the morning light. "Do you think we'll see any bears?" "Hope not," Sarah muttered, but David caught her eye in the rearview mirror and winked. "If we do see one, we'll be ready," he said confidently. "Bears are more afraid of us than we are of them, right, kiddo?" Jake nodded enthusiastically, but Emma looked up from her phone with the skeptical expression she'd perfected over the past year. "Dad, my phone died like an hour ago. There's literally no signal out here. What if something happens?" "That's the point, Em," David said. 3 days without technology, just us and nature. You'll thank me when you're older." Emma exchanged a look with her mother that said she seriously doubted that, but she didn't argue further. The family had been planning this trip as Emma's last big adventure before college applications consumed her senior year, and despite her reservations, she was secretly looking forward to the time with her family. The Willow Creek trailhead was nothing more than a gravel parking area with a weathered wooden sign and a brown metal box containing wilderness permits. 3 other vehicles were already parked there: a red Subaru with Colorado plates, a white pickup truck covered in hunting stickers, and a blue Honda Civic that looked distinctly out of place in the wilderness setting. As the Carlsons unloaded their gear, an older man emerged from the forest, heavily laden with camping equipment. His weathered face and confident stride marked him as someone who'd spent considerable time in the backcountry. He approached their group with the easy familiarity of experienced outdoors people. "You folks heading up to Copper Lake?" he asked, adjusting the straps on his massive backpack. "That's the plan," David replied, extending his hand. "David Carlson. This is my wife Sarah and our kids Emma and Jake." "Tom Hendricks," the man replied, shaking David's hand with a grip that spoke of years of manual labor. "Been coming up here for 20 years. Beautiful country up there. But I've got to tell you, saw some fresh grizzly sign yesterday about 4 miles up the trail. Big tracks, recent scat. Looks like a mature boar." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "How recent?" "Yesterday morning, I'd guess. Maybe the night before." Tom's expression grew serious. "Listen, I don't want to scare you folks, but this is September. The bears are hyperphagia right now, eating up to 20,000 calories a day before hibernation. Makes them more aggressive, less predictable. You got bear spray?" David patted the canister on his belt. 4 cans plus a rifle." Tom nodded approvingly. "Good. Just remember, if you see one, don't run. Make yourself big, speak in a calm voice, and back away slowly. If it charges, use the spray when it gets within 30 feet. Most charges are bluffs, but not all of them." After Tom disappeared down the trail toward the parking area, the family finished their preparations in subdued silence. Sarah double-checked their food storage containers while David studied his GPS unit and topographical maps. The trail to Copper Lake was well marked but demanding, gaining nearly 3,000 feet of elevation over 8 miles of wilderness. They started hiking at 10:30 in the morning, with David leading and Sarah bringing up the rear. The trail began as a gentle climb through dense forest, but quickly became more challenging as it switchbacked up the mountainside. Jake, despite carrying the lightest pack, began complaining within the first mile. "How much farther?" he wheezed, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool air. 7 miles, Emma replied with sisterly precision, "and 2 hours and 53 minutes based on our current pace." "Thanks, human GPS," Jake muttered. The forest around them was a cathedral of towering trees, their trunks disappearing into the canopy high above. Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and western larch created a living wall on either side of the narrow trail. The understory was thick with huckleberry bushes, many still heavy with dark purple berries that Sarah knew would attract bears. About 2 miles up the trail, David called for their first break near a small creek. As the family rested and refilled their water bottles, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Pressed into the soft mud beside the creek were massive paw prints, each one nearly the size of a dinner plate. 4 long claw marks extended from each toe, gouging deep furrows in the earth. "David," she called quietly, not wanting to alarm the children. But her husband was already examining the tracks, his face grim. "Fresh," he murmured. "Maybe a few hours old." Emma appeared at Sarah's shoulder and gasped. "Those are huge. How big would a bear have to be to make tracks like that?" David stood slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to the bear spray on his belt. "A big one. Maybe 400 pounds or more." He tried to keep his voice casual, but Sarah could hear the tension beneath. "Probably just passing through. We'll make plenty of noise as we hike." They resumed their journey with heightened awareness. David began calling out, "Hey, bear!" every few minutes, and Sarah found herself jumping at every snapped twig or rustling bush. The children picked up on their parents' nervousness, and soon the family was hiking in an island of noise through the silent forest. The trail grew steeper as they climbed higher, and the character of the forest began to change. The thick canopy gave way to more open areas where avalanches and forest fires had cleared patches of mountainside. These natural meadows were carpeted with late-season wildflowers and offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks, but they also provided less cover and made Sarah feel exposed. It was in one of these meadows, about 4 miles from the trailhead, that they encountered the other hikers Tom had mentioned. A young couple was resting beside a cluster of granite boulders, their packs suggesting they were on a multi-day journey. The woman looked to be in her early 20s, with the lean build and sun-weathered skin of someone who spent serious time outdoors. Her male companion was older, perhaps early 30s, with the careful movements of someone nursing an injury. "Mind if we join you?" David called as they approached. The couple waved them over, and introductions were quickly made. The woman was Rebecca Torres, a graduate student in wildlife biology from Colorado State University. Her companion was Mark Chen, a photographer from Seattle who was documenting wildlife behavior for a magazine assignment. "You folks see any sign of the big grizzly that's been working this area?" Rebecca asked after they'd settled in for a rest. "I've been tracking him for 3 days. Massive male, probably 20 years old or more. Local rangers call him Scarface because of damage to his muzzle from an old snare." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "We saw tracks by the creek about 2 miles back." Rebecca nodded grimly. "That sounds about right. He's been following this drainage system, hitting all the huckleberry patches. Problem is, the berry crop was light this year because of the drought. He's not getting the calories he needs for winter prep, which makes him more likely to investigate human food sources." Mark winced as he adjusted his position against the boulder. "We actually saw him yesterday afternoon, about a mile up from here. I was trying to get photos when he suddenly focused on us. We backed away slowly, but he followed us for maybe a quarter mile before losing interest." "Followed you?" David's voice was sharp. "That's not normal behavior." "No, it's not," Rebecca agreed. "Food-conditioned bears will sometimes follow humans, hoping to find unsecured food. But this guy, there was something different about him. More assertive than most grizzlies. Could be his age, could be hunger, or maybe he's had positive encounters with humans before, meaning someone fed him or left food where he could get it." Emma had gone pale during this conversation. "Should we turn back?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "If you're experienced and properly equipped, you should be fine. Just follow all the food storage protocols religiously. Hang everything at least 12 feet high and 4 feet from any tree trunk. Make noise when you're moving around camp. Never leave food in your tent, not even a candy bar wrapper. They parted company an hour later, with Rebecca and Mark heading toward a research station deeper in the wilderness, while the Carlsons continued toward Copper Lake. But the encounter had shaken the family's confidence, and they hiked the remaining 4 miles in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might encounter in the woods ahead. Copper Lake was everything David had promised, a pristine alpine jewel nestled in a cirque of granite peaks. The water was so clear that they could see trout moving in the depths, 40 feet below the surface. A small meadow on the lake's eastern shore provided the perfect camping spot, with level ground for their tents and a clear view across the water to the imposing peaks beyond. They set up camp with methodical efficiency, David insisting on perfection in every detail. Their 2 tents, a larger one for him and Sarah, a smaller one for the kids, were positioned 30 yards from their cooking area and even farther from where they would hang their food. David had brought a 60-foot length of parachute cord specifically for food storage, and he spent nearly an hour finding the perfect tree with a suitable branch configuration. As evening approached, Sarah prepared their first dinner over a small camp stove while David gathered firewood. The children explored the shoreline, skipping stones and marveling at the absolute silence that surrounded them. No traffic noise, no aircraft, no human sounds of any kind, except their own voices echoing softly across the water. "This is incredible," Emma admitted, her earlier reservations forgotten as she watched the sun begin to set behind the western peaks. "I can see why you wanted to bring us here, Dad." David beamed with paternal pride as he arranged logs for their evening fire. "Wait until you see the stars tonight. No light pollution for 100 miles in any direction. You'll see the Milky Way like you've never seen it before." But as darkness fell and they gathered around their small campfire, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow beyond the firelight seemed to hold potential menace, and the normal sounds of the forest, owl calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant splash of a beaver in the lake, all seemed amplified and somehow threatening. "Did you hear that?" she asked during a lull in conversation, her head tilted toward the forest behind their camp. The family fell silent, listening intently. For several seconds, there was nothing but the crackle of burning wood and the gentle lap of water against the shore. Then from somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp came a sound that made Sarah's blood freeze, a low, rumbling grunt that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "Bear," David whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol concealed under his jacket. "Everyone stay calm. Stay together." They sat motionless around their small fire for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, straining to identify every sound in the darkness around them. The grunt wasn't repeated, but Sarah was certain she could feel a presence somewhere beyond the reach of their firelight, something large and patient, watching them with intelligent eyes. "Maybe it was just passing through," Emma whispered hopefully, but her voice carried no conviction. David kept his hand near his concealed weapon while scanning the darkness beyond their camp. "We'll take turns keeping watch tonight. 2-hour shifts. Sarah, you and I will take the first watch." "Dad, I'm scared," Jake admitted, moving closer to his father's side. "We're going to be fine," David replied, with more confidence than he felt. "Bears are naturally afraid of fire. As long as we keep the campfire burning, we should be okay." But Sarah remembered something Rebecca had mentioned during their conversation, that Scarface had approached an occupied campsite during daylight hours and shown no fear response to human voices or noisemakers. If the bear wasn't afraid of humans, would it be afraid of their small campfire? They maintained their vigil until nearly midnight, feeding small sticks to their fire and jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. When David finally announced it was safe to sleep, Sarah was grateful to retreat to their tent, but she lay awake for hours listening to every rustle and snap in the woods outside. Her fears proved justified around 2 in the morning, when she was awakened by a sound that made her blood freeze. Heavy breathing just outside their tent, so close she could hear the wet rasp of air moving through massive lungs. "David," she whispered urgently, shaking her husband awake. "There's something right outside." David came instantly alert, listening to the measured breathing that seemed to circle their tent with deliberate slowness. Very carefully he reached for the flashlight beside his sleeping bag and clicked it on, the beam illuminating the thin nylon wall that separated them from whatever was outside. The breathing stopped immediately, but they could both see the shadow of something enormous projected against the tent wall, a shape too large and the wrong proportion to be anything other than a massive bear. For several heartbeats, predator and prey remained motionless, separated only by fabric that wouldn't slow a determined grizzly for even a second. Then the shadow moved away from their tent, and they could hear heavy footsteps moving toward the smaller tent where Emma and Jake were sleeping. "No," Sarah breathed, already unzipping the tent door. "Not the kids." David grabbed her arm. "Sarah, don't. If you go out there..." But Sarah was already moving, her maternal instincts overriding every rational thought about safety. She burst from their tent into the cool night air, wearing only a t-shirt and underwear, shouting at the massive shape that was investigating her children's tent. "Get away from them!" she screamed, waving her arms and making herself as large as possible. "Go on! Get out of here!" Scarface turned from the smaller tent to face this new threat, and Sarah got her first clear look at the creature that had been stalking them. In the moonlight, he was even more massive than she'd imagined, easily 8 feet tall when he reared up on his hind legs to assess her. His fur was dark brown, almost black, and his massive head seemed disproportionately large even for his huge body. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle, and one ear was partially torn, giving him a battle-hardened appearance that spoke of decades of survival in the wilderness. For a moment that lasted forever, woman and bear stared at each other across 20 feet of grass and stone. Sarah could see intelligence in his dark eyes, a calculation that was far more frightening than simple animal aggression. This wasn't a creature acting on instinct. This was a predator making conscious decisions about her family's fate. David appeared beside her, the pistol now visible in his hand. "Sarah, back away slowly. Don't make any sudden movements." But even as he spoke, they both realized that the bear wasn't displaying typical threat behavior. No huffing, no jaw popping, no swaying from side to side. Scarface simply stood and watched them with the patience of a creature that had all the time in the world. From the smaller tent came the sound of Emma and Jake waking up, their frightened voices muffled by the nylon walls. "Mom, Dad, what's happening?" "Stay in the tent," David called without taking his eyes off the bear. "Whatever you do, don't come outside." The standoff continued for several more minutes before Scarface finally dropped back to all fours and moved away from their camp. But he didn't leave the area entirely. Instead, he settled down beside a fallen log about 50 yards away, clearly visible in the moonlight, and began what could only be described as a vigil. "He's not leaving," Sarah whispered as they retreated to their tent. "He's just curious," David replied, though his voice carried no conviction. Wild animals are naturally curious about human activity. But they both knew this wasn't curiosity. This was something far more dangerous, a predator that had identified potential prey and was waiting for the right moment to act. They spent the rest of the night in wakeful terror, taking turns at the tent door to monitor Scarface's position. The bear never moved more than 100 yards from their camp, and several times they saw him rise to test the wind, clearly tracking their scent and movements. Dawn came as a relief, but it also brought the sobering realization that they were trapped. The bear showed no signs of leaving, and David began to understand that their situation was far more serious than he'd initially believed. "We need to pack up and hike out," Sarah said as they huddled in their tent, speaking in whispers. "Right now, while it's daylight." "He's still out there," David replied, peering through a gap in the tent zipper. "If we start moving around, breaking camp, we might trigger an attack." Emma's voice came from the smaller tent, tight with barely controlled panic. "Dad, what are we going to do?" David was beginning to realize that his careful planning had been inadequate for the situation they were facing. All of his research about bear safety had focused on brief encounters, not prolonged stalking behavior. He had no backup plan for being trapped in their camp by a predator that showed no fear of humans. "We wait," he said finally. "Maybe he'll lose interest and move on." But Scarface showed no signs of losing interest. Throughout the morning he maintained his position near their camp, occasionally moving to investigate different areas, but never venturing far enough away to give them a chance to escape. By noon, it became clear that the bear was exhibiting behavior that was completely outside the normal range for wild grizzlies. "This isn't random," Sarah observed as they watched the bear methodically patrol the perimeter of their camp. "He's keeping us here intentionally." David was forced to acknowledge what he'd been trying not to think, that they were being held captive by a predator that was sophisticated enough to understand containment strategies. Scarface had effectively trapped them in their camp and was waiting for something, though David couldn't imagine what. They spent the second day in a state of siege, rationing their water and trying to stay calm while the bear maintained his vigil. The children were increasingly frightened, and Sarah was beginning to show signs of the extreme stress that came from being prey to a superior predator. "Maybe if we all leave together," Emma suggested during the afternoon. "If we stay close together and make a lot of noise." "No," David said firmly. "That bear could run us down in seconds if he decided to charge. Our only chance is to wait for him to leave." But as their second evening approached, Scarface's behavior became even more disturbing. Instead of settling down for the night, he began circling their camp at a distance of about 100 yards, moving with the fluid grace of a creature that was completely comfortable in its environment. "He's hunting us," Sarah realized with dawning horror. "He's herding us, keeping us contained until he's ready to attack." David could no longer deny what his wife had recognized, that they were facing a predator that was employing sophisticated hunting strategies typically associated with pack animals, not solitary grizzlies. Scarface wasn't just a bear behaving unusually. He was a bear that had learned to hunt humans with the same methodical approach he would use on any other prey species. As darkness fell on their second night, the family huddled together in the larger tent, listening to the sound of the bear moving through their camp. They could hear him investigating their equipment, testing their food storage, and systematically learning everything about their capabilities and resources. "He's learning about us," Emma whispered. "He's figuring out how we behave, what we're capable of." It was a terrifying realization that they were being studied by a predator intelligent enough to develop hunting strategies specific to their situation. Scarface wasn't acting on instinct. He was planning their deaths with the calculated patience of an apex predator that had learned to view humans as just another prey species. The attack came at 3:17 a.m. on their third night, when exhaustion and stress had finally worn down their vigilance enough for Scarface to make his move. Sarah was awakened not by sound, but by the absence of sound, a sudden, total silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. Even the normal night sounds of the forest had stopped completely, as if every living thing was holding its breath in anticipation of violence. "David," she whispered, shaking her husband awake. "Something's wrong." David came instantly alert, a skill developed through years of being awakened by emergency calls from clients. The silence struck him immediately. No wind in the trees, no water lapping against the shoreline, no night birds calling in the distance. It was as if the entire world had paused to watch what was about to happen. Then they heard it, the sound of their smaller tent being slowly, methodically destroyed. The noise was horrifyingly deliberate, the whisper of claws slicing through nylon, the soft pop of tent stakes being pulled from the earth, the rustle of fabric being carefully pushed aside. Scarface was dismantling Emma and Jake's shelter with surgical precision, taking his time to ensure that his prey had no escape route. "Mum! Dad!" Emma's voice carried clearly through the night air, tight with terror but trying to remain calm. "He's right outside. He's opening our tent." David was already moving, grabbing the pistol and bear spray, while Sarah pulled on her hiking boots. Through the thin wall of their own tent, they could see the massive shadow of the bear as he worked to expose their children to the night air. "Jake, Emma, stay low and try to move toward our tent," David called, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Move slowly. Don't run." But even as he spoke, they could all hear the sound that would haunt Sarah's nightmares for the rest of her life. Jake's scream of pure terror as Scarface finally breached their tent's defenses. David burst from their shelter into the moonlit chaos of their demolished camp, the pistol ready in his hand. What he saw froze his blood. Scarface had Jake pinned beneath one massive paw, the boy's small body completely helpless against 400 pounds of muscle and bone. Emma was pressed against the far side of their destroyed tent, trapped but still alive, watching in horror as the bear prepared to kill her younger brother. "Hey!" David shouted, firing the pistol twice into the air. "Get away from him!" The gunshots echoed across the lake like thunder, but Scarface barely acknowledged them. The old bear had heard gunshots before, from hunters, from rangers, from other people who thought they could scare him away with noise. After 20 years in the wilderness, he understood that most humans were reluctant to actually shoot him, preferring to fire warning shots in the hope that he would retreat. But David wasn't most humans. He was a father watching his son about to be killed, and his next shot wasn't a warning. The .44 Magnum bullet caught Scarface in the shoulder, spinning him away from Jake and sending him into a rage that transformed him from a calculating predator into a force of pure destruction. The bear's roar shattered the night silence, a sound so primal and furious that it seemed to make the very mountains tremble. Jake rolled away from the wounded bear and tried to crawl toward his parents, but he was injured. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and blood was already soaking through his torn shirt. "Dad!" he called weakly. "Help me!" David was reloading the pistol when Scarface charged, covering the 30 feet between them in less than 3 seconds. The bear's speed was shocking, a blur of dark fur and gleaming teeth that seemed to materialize out of the darkness with supernatural swiftness. Sarah sprayed the entire contents of her bear spray canister directly into Scarface's face as he reached her husband, but the chemical irritant only seemed to enrage the animal further. David got off one more shot, this one catching the bear center mass, before 400 pounds of fury drove him to the ground with bone-crushing force. The impact of the bear's charge knocked David unconscious immediately, and Sarah watched in horror as Scarface began the methodical process of killing her husband. The bear's powerful jaws worked with terrifying efficiency, and David's initial screams quickly gave way to the wet, gurgling sounds that meant irreversible damage was being done. "Run!" Sarah screamed to her children. "Get to the trees!" Emma grabbed her injured brother and half-carried, half-dragged him toward the cluster of large Douglas firs behind their demolished camp. Jake was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored, but Emma managed to get him to the base of the largest tree and started pushing him up into the lower branches. Sarah followed them, not daring to look back at what was happening to her husband. Behind her, David's sounds had stopped entirely, and she knew with sick certainty that he was beyond help. Her only thought now was saving her children. getting them high enough in the trees that Scarface couldn't reach them. The bear was still busy with David when they reached the tree, giving them precious minutes to climb higher into the branches. Emma proved surprisingly strong, boosting Jake up ahead of her despite his injuries, then following him into the relative safety of the upper branches. Sarah was last, and she was 20 feet off the ground when Scarface finished with her husband and turned his attention to the survivors. The bear approached the tree with the patient confidence of a predator that understood its prey had no escape route. "Higher," Sarah whispered urgently, pushing Jake toward branches that would barely support his weight. "Get as high as you can go." But Jake was weakening from blood loss and shock, and his injured arm made climbing increasingly difficult. "Mom, I can't," he gasped. "I can't hold on." Scarface reached the base of their tree and reared up on his hind legs, his massive paws scratching deep furrows in the bark as he tried to reach them. He stood nearly 10 feet tall in this position, bringing him close enough that Sarah could see the bullet wounds in his shoulder and chest, wounds that had slowed him but were far from fatal. When it became clear that the humans were beyond his immediate reach, Scarface dropped back to all fours and began the waiting game that had served him well throughout his long life as a predator. He settled down at the base of the tree like a patient fisherman, occasionally looking up at them with what Sarah could only describe as anticipation. "He's not going to leave," Emma whispered, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "He's going to wait for us to fall." It was a horrifyingly accurate assessment of their situation. They couldn't climb down, they couldn't stay up in the tree indefinitely, and there was no one coming to help them. They were trapped 40 feet above a killer that had already demonstrated his willingness to wait as long as necessary for his prey to become vulnerable. Hours passed in agonizing slowness. Jake's condition continued to deteriorate. His injured arm had stopped bleeding, but his breathing was becoming more labored, and he was having increasing difficulty maintaining his grip on the tree branches. Emma tried to position herself to catch him if he fell, but she was exhausting herself in the effort. Sarah found herself praying for the first time since childhood, desperate bargains with a god she'd largely ignored for most of her adult life. She promised anything, everything, if her children could somehow survive the next few hours. But Scarface continued his vigil below, patient as death itself. The first to fall was Jake, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the eastern peaks. Exhaustion, blood loss and shock had finally overcome his ability to hold on, and he slipped from his perch with barely a sound. Sarah tried desperately to catch him, but her own grip was failing, and she succeeded only in breaking her own fall as she followed her son down into Scarface's waiting embrace. The bear killed Jake quickly, a single bite that crushed his neck and ended his suffering in seconds. But with Sarah, Scarface took his time, perhaps triggered by her screams and struggles into displaying the full range of his predatory capabilities. When it was over, only Emma remained alive, 30 feet above ground and completely alone. The bear looked up at her for a long moment, as if considering whether the remaining morsel was worth the wait. Then, with the practical wisdom of a creature that had survived 20 years in the wilderness, he began dragging the bodies away from the tree to cache them in a more secure location where he could feed undisturbed. Emma clung to her branch and watched her family disappear into the forest, piece by piece, carried away by a predator that had systematically destroyed everything she'd ever cared about. She was alone in the wilderness, miles from help, with no food, no water, and no realistic hope of survival. But Emma Carlson was her father's daughter, with the same stubborn determination that had made David successful in the courtroom. She waited until Scarface had finished his grisly work and moved deeper into the forest with his prizes. Then she climbed down from the tree and began the longest journey of her life, 8 miles through grisly country to the parking area where their car waited. She walked through the day and into the night, following the trail by moonlight, stopping only when exhaustion forced her to rest for a few minutes at a time. Her cell phone had been in the tent that Scarface destroyed, so she had no way to call for help. Her only choice was to keep walking, to put one foot in front of the other until she reached civilization, or died trying. Emma reached the trailhead at dawn on the fourth day, dehydrated and exhausted but alive. Tom Hendricks was just arriving for another hiking trip and found her collapsed beside the trail register, mumbling incoherently about bears and blood and bodies in the trees. The search and rescue operation that followed was one of the largest in Montana history. Teams of rangers, wildlife biologists and volunteers scoured the Copper Lake area for any trace of the Carlson family. They found the destroyed campsite quickly enough: scattered gear, blood-stained earth, and drag marks leading into the dense forest. But Scarface had done his work well. The bodies were cached in locations known only to him, hidden in places where 20 years of experience had taught him that scavengers and investigators were unlikely to find them. Search teams recovered scattered remains over several weeks, but never enough to determine exactly what had happened during those final hours at Copper Lake. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Scarface's predatory career. DNA analysis linked him to at least 6 other attacks over the previous 5 years, incidents that had been attributed to different bears or explained away as defensive encounters. Wildlife biologists realized that they had been tracking not just an unusually large bear, but one that had developed sophisticated hunting strategies specifically for human prey. Dr. Rebecca Torres, the graduate student who had warned the Carlsons about unusual bear activity, spent months studying the attack site and interviewing Emma about her family's ordeal. Her resulting research paper, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, documented the first confirmed case of systematic predatory behavior toward humans by a North American grizzly bear. What we learned from the Carlson case, Dr. Torres wrote, is that our assumptions about grizzly behavior may be dangerously outdated. Climate change, habitat loss, and food scarcity are creating conditions that push these apex predators beyond their normal behavioral boundaries. Scarface wasn't an aberration. He was an adaptation. Emma Carlson survived her ordeal, but was forever changed by it. The confident teenager who had hiked into the wilderness with her family emerged as a traumatized young woman who would spend years in therapy learning to cope with survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress. She never returned to the outdoors, never went camping again, and required medication to sleep through the night without nightmares about dark shapes moving through moonlit forests. Scarface was finally tracked down and killed 6 weeks after the Carlson attack, but not before claiming 2 more victims near Glacier National Park. The old bear's final hunt ended when a team of wildlife specialists cornered him in a box canyon and ended his 20-year reign as one of Montana's most successful predators. But the damage was done. The Carlson case changed how wildlife managers viewed grizzly-human interactions and led to significant changes in backcountry safety protocols. Warning signs were posted throughout the region. Camping restrictions were implemented in certain areas during late summer and fall, and educational programs began emphasizing that bear spray and noisemakers were not foolproof deterrents against predatory bears. The family's ranch house stood empty for 2 years before finally being sold to a developer who subdivided the property and built smaller homes designed to appeal to buyers who preferred neighbors to isolation. The new owners knew about the Carlson family's fate. The story had become part of local folklore, but they chose to focus on the home's beautiful setting rather than the tragedy that had befallen its original owners. Sometimes, on clear September nights, when the wind moved through the pine trees behind the property, neighbors reported hearing sounds that reminded them of the Carlson's story. A low moaning that would rise to a roar before trailing off into silence. Wildlife officials insisted it was just elk calling during rutting season, or perhaps the wind moving through the granite canyons behind the subdivision. But the sounds always came in September, during the weeks when grizzly bears entered hyperphagia and began their desperate search for the calories that would carry them through winter. And long-time residents of the area, people who had lived in grizzly country long enough to understand its rhythms and dangers, would listen to those sounds and remember that some places in the world remain exactly as wild and dangerous as they were 1,000 years ago. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness still stretches across hundreds of thousands of acres of pristine mountain country. Hikers still venture into its depths, seeking the kind of adventure that the Carlson family had hoped to find. But they do so with a heightened awareness of the risks, carrying satellite communicators and traveling in larger groups, understanding that they are visitors in a realm that belongs to creatures older and more dangerous than anything in their suburban experience. Copper Lake still reflects the granite peaks in its crystal-clear depths. Trout still move through the water like living shadows, and wildflowers still carpet the alpine meadows in late summer. But the lake's beauty now carries a different weight for those who know its history, a reminder that nature's indifference to human plans and human lives is not a metaphor, but a literal truth that can manifest with shocking suddenness. The trail to Copper Lake remains open to the public, but it now carries warning signs about aggressive bear activity and recommendations for group travel and enhanced safety precautions. Most hikers heed these warnings, but some, particularly those who believe that tragedy always happens to other people, continue to venture into the wilderness with nothing more than confidence and good intentions to protect them. And sometimes, when conditions are right, and the bears are desperate, and an old predator's territory overlaps with human ambition, those good intentions prove insufficient. The wilderness keeps what it claims, and the Carlson family's story serves as eternal proof that some places in this world demand respect that goes far deeper than human understanding. Emma Carlson, now Emma Morrison after taking her husband's name in an effort to distance herself from her family's tragedy, lives in suburban Denver with 2 young children. She refuses to take camping. She works as an advocate for wilderness safety education and speaks occasionally at conferences about the need for better public understanding of predatory wildlife behavior. But she never speaks publicly about the specific details of what happened during those final hours at Copper Lake. Those memories remain locked away in a part of her mind that she accesses only during the worst nightmares, when she relives the sound of her brother's screams and the sight of her parents disappearing piece by piece into the forest that had seemed so beautiful just days before. The official cause of death for David, Sarah, and Jake Carlson was listed as fatal injuries resulting from grizzly bear attack, a clinical description that captured none of the horror of their final hours. But for those who study predatory behavior in large carnivores, the Carlson case represents something far more significant. Proof that the line between human and animal, predator and prey, civilization and wilderness, is far thinner than most people imagine. Dr. Rebecca Torres continued her research into unusual grizzly behavior and eventually established herself as one of the world's leading experts on predatory attacks by North American bears. Her work, funded partly by a foundation established in the Carlson's memory, focuses on understanding the environmental and social factors that can transform a normally omnivorous bear into a systematic human predator. The Carlson case taught us that we can't simply assume that our presence in the wilderness will be tolerated, she explains to students in her graduate seminar on human-wildlife conflict. Scarface had learned to view humans as a food source, and once that behavioral pattern was established, he became essentially unstoppable until he was eliminated. The tragedy is that there were warning signs, reports of unusual behavior, signs of predatory interest, but our management protocols weren't adequate to address the threat. The lessons learned from the Carlsons' deaths have saved other lives, as improved safety protocols and better public education have reduced the number of fatal bear encounters in the region. But for Emma Morrison, sitting in her suburban Denver home and watching her own children play in a fenced backyard that Scarface could never reach, the academic discussions about wildlife management feel inadequate to capture the reality of what her family experienced. Her children know that their mother grew up in Montana and that their grandparents died in an accident, but Emma has never told them the truth about what happened at Copper Lake. She hopes they never need to know, that they can grow up in a world where the worst dangers are drunk drivers and house fires and other modern hazards that seem manageable compared to 400 pounds of apex predator stalking through a moonlit forest. But sometimes, when the wind is right and her windows are open on a cool September evening, Emma thinks she can hear something in the distance that reminds her of that terrible night. A low sound that might be traffic or machinery or just her imagination, but which makes her close the windows and check the locks and remember that some fears never entirely fade, no matter how many years pass or how far you travel from the places that taught you what real terror means. The wilderness endures, beautiful and indifferent, and utterly without mercy for those who mistake its spectacular beauty for safety. The Carlson family's story has become part of the oral tradition of Grizzly Country, told around campfires and in ranger stations, as a reminder that respect for wild places must be grounded in realistic understanding of the dangers they contain. And somewhere in the vast reaches of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, other old bears patrol territories that have remained unchanged for thousands of years, following ancient patterns of hunting and feeding and survival that predate human civilization by millennia. They are patient creatures, these bears, with all the time in the world to wait for the right opportunity, the right combination of circumstances, the right moment when human confidence meets apex predator in a place where only one will survive the encounter. The last trail leads into country that belongs to them, not us. The Carlson family learned that truth too late, but their story ensures that others might learn it in time to matter before they venture too far into places where the old rules still apply, and where being human provides no protection against creatures that have never forgotten what it truly means to be wild.